Neoclassicism, the revival of classical art forms, written by Event, narrated by Kara Miller. Chapter 1, Introduction to Neoclassicism. Neoclassicism was an art movement that emerged in the mid-18th century as a response to the excesses and ornate style of the Baroque and Rococo periods. It sought to return to the classical ideals of ancient Greece and Rome, emphasizing simplicity, balance, and harmony. This revival was deeply rooted in a growing interest in the art and culture of antiquity, sparked by the discovery of ancient ruins like Pompeii and Herculaneum. These excavations revealed a wealth of classical art and architecture that greatly influenced artists and intellectuals of the time. At its core, Neoclassicism was more than just an aesthetic choice. It was a philosophical and cultural movement. It was closely aligned with the Enlightenment, a period in which reason, scientific inquiry, and a return to rational thought were paramount. Neoclassical artists, writers, and philosophers embraced the ideals of order, discipline, and virtue that were exemplified in ancient art and literature. These values were seen as a counterpoint to the emotionalism and extravagance of the preceding Baroque and Rococo styles. The movement gained momentum in the wake of the French Revolution, where the classical ideals of democracy, virtue, and civic duty resonated with revolutionary leaders. The period's political upheavals also played a significant role in the resurgence of classical themes, as neoclassical art became a symbol of national pride and civic responsibility. Artists like Jacques-Louis David became prominent figures during this time, using their works to reflect the political and social upheavals of the period. The style's emphasis on clarity, rationality, and moral integrity offered a stark contrast to the previous era's flamboyant and sometimes frivolous expressions. In terms of visual elements, neoclassical art favored clean lines, restrained color palettes, and an emphasis on idealized human forms. Sculptors and painters looked to classical Greek and Roman models, creating works that embodied the humanist ideals of beauty, strength, and wisdom. The subjects of neoclassical art range from classical mythology and history to contemporary political themes, all viewed through the lens of idealized antiquity. The movement quickly spread across Europe, influencing art, architecture, literature, and even design. From the grand neoclassical buildings of London and Paris to the heroic sculptures of Rome, neoclassicism left a lasting mark on the cultural landscape. By the end of the 18th century, it had firmly established itself as one of the dominant artistic styles, shaping the visual and intellectual culture of the Western world for generations to come. Definition and overview of Neoclassicism. Neoclassicism was an artistic and cultural movement that arose in the mid-18th century as a revival of the classical art and ideals of ancient Greece and Rome. This movement sought to return to the simplicity, order, and rationality that characterized classical antiquity, in contrast to the ornate and often excessive style of the preceding Baroque and Rococo periods. Neoclassicism emerged as part of a broader intellectual and philosophical shift that was influenced by the Enlightenment, a time of intellectual awakening and the rise of reason, scientific exploration, and a critical reassessment of tradition. At its core, neoclassicism was a reaction against the emotional excesses and theatricality of the Baroque style, which was characterized by dramatic lighting, vivid colors, and intense emotions. The Rococo style, which followed the Baroque period, further emphasized opulence, intricate decoration, and playful themes. Neoclassicism, in contrast, emphasized clarity, balance, and restraint, drawing inspiration from the art, architecture, and literature of ancient civilizations. The movement aimed to revive the principles of harmony, proportion, and idealized beauty that were central to classical art forms. The rediscovery of ancient Roman and Greek ruins, such as the excavations of Pompeii and Herculaneum, played a pivotal role in sparking neoclassicism. These archaeological discoveries revealed an abundance of classical art and artifacts that influenced artists, architects, and philosophers. As a result, neoclassical art focused on the representation of historical and mythological themes, often idealized and portrayed in a manner that reflected the virtues of ancient heroes, gods, and statesmen. In visual terms, neoclassical art was marked by its emphasis on linear precision, restrained color palettes, and realistic depictions of the human form. Artists and sculptors adhered to classical proportions and sought to portray figures in ways that conveyed strength, dignity, and virtue. The movement's influence extended beyond painting and sculpture into architecture, where neoclassical structures like the Parthenon in Athens became models for the design of public buildings, monuments, and homes throughout Europe and America. Neoclassicism was not merely an artistic style, but also a cultural movement that permeated literature, philosophy, and politics. It was closely tied to the ideals of the Enlightenment, with its emphasis on reason, civic duty, and the belief that art and culture could promote moral and social improvement. The movement had a profound impact on the development of Western art, leaving a legacy that continues to influence contemporary culture. Origins and historical context. Neoclassicism emerged in the mid-18th century as a response to the ornate, emotional styles of Baroque and Rococo art, drawing inspiration from the art and culture of ancient Greece and Rome. The roots of the movement lie in the intellectual and cultural shifts that were taking place during the Age of Enlightenment, a period marked by a focus on reason, scientific discovery, and a critical reassessment of traditional beliefs and institutions. Intellectuals and artists began to question the extravagance of the previous eras, seeking a return to the ideals of simplicity, clarity, and moral virtue that they saw embodied in classical antiquity. The catalyst for this revival of classical forms was the discovery of ancient Roman and Greek ruins, most notably the excavations of Pompeii and Herculaneum in the 1730s. These archaeological digs revealed remarkably well-preserved examples of classical art, sculpture, and architecture, which had been buried for centuries. As these ancient artifacts were uncovered, they captured the imagination of artists, architects, and scholars who saw them as a model for a new artistic approach that emphasized order, proportion, and timeless beauty. The ruins sparked a renewed interest in the classical world, inspiring a generation of artists and thinkers to draw upon the aesthetic and intellectual legacy of ancient civilizations. At the same time, the Enlightenment ideals of reason, progress, and civic virtue were shaping political and philosophical discourse. Thinkers such as Voltaire, Rousseau, and Montesquieu promoted ideas of liberty, democracy, and rational governance, often looking to the political structures of ancient Greece and Rome as models for modern society. This intellectual climate influenced the rise of Neoclassicism, as artists and architects saw their work as not only a return to classical beauty, but also as a way to embody these Enlightenment ideals. In a way, Neoclassicism became a visual language for expressing the values of the Enlightenment, celebrating reason, virtue, and the pursuit of knowledge. The movement also gained momentum through the rise of a newly affluent middle class that had access to education and cultural activities. With growing political and social changes, especially in France, Neoclassicism resonated with revolutionary sentiments as its ideals of heroism, virtue, and moral integrity aligned with the revolutionary rhetoric of liberty, equality, and fraternity. This historical context set the stage for Neoclassicism to become a dominant artistic force across Europe, influencing not only painting and sculpture, but also architecture, literature, and design. Influence of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment, which spanned the late 17th and 18th centuries, profoundly influenced the development of Neoclassicism, shaping both its artistic forms and intellectual underpinnings. The movement, which championed reason, individualism, and progress, encouraged a break from the traditions of the past, especially the elaborate and emotionally driven Baroque and Rococo styles. Enlightenment thinkers, such as Voltaire, Rousseau, and John Locke advocated for reason as the ultimate source of knowledge and understanding, emphasizing the importance of logic, scientific inquiry, and the rational examination of society. And these ideals found a natural ally in Neoclassicism, which sought to reflect the rationality, simplicity, and order that the Enlightenment valued. At the heart of Neoclassicism was the belief that art could be a vehicle for promoting moral and civic virtues. Classical antiquity, which was admired by Enlightenment thinkers for its emphasis on reason, democracy, and civic duty, provided a model for artists and architects seeking to embody these values. Ancient Greece and Rome were viewed not only as sources of aesthetic beauty, but also as societies that had achieved a perfect balance between reason and culture. Enlightenment thinkers believed that by returning to the classical world's ideals, modern society could correct the excesses and irrationalities that had plagued previous centuries. The rise of public education and the spread of Enlightenment ideas made classical knowledge more accessible than ever before. Educated citizens began to see the ideals of classical antiquity as both aspirational and practical, especially in terms of governance and civic responsibility. Neoclassical art reflected these values, often depicting historical events, allegorical figures, and mythological subjects that embodied concepts such as heroism, sacrifice, and virtue. Artists like Jacques-Louis David, whose works portrayed the moral integrity of historical figures, aligned closely with the Enlightenment's belief in reason and the importance of ethics. Moreover, the Enlightenment's emphasis on universal rights and social reform also influenced the political context in which Neoclassicism flourished. As revolutionary ideas about democracy and the rights of the individual gained traction, neoclassical artists, especially in France, used their work to reflect the desire for political and social change. The symbolism in neoclassical art was aligned with the Enlightenment's vision of a just society based on reason, equality, and morality. Neoclassicism, therefore, was not just an artistic style, but an intellectual movement, deeply interconnected with the cultural, political, and philosophical transformations of the Enlightenment. Key characteristics of neoclassical art. Neoclassical art is defined by a return to the classical ideals of ancient Greece and Rome, emphasizing clarity, balance, and restrained beauty. This movement marked a shift away from the emotional intensity and ornamental complexity of the Baroque and Rococo styles. At its core, Neoclassicism sought to restore the ideals of simplicity, order, and rationality that were seen as the hallmark of classical antiquity. Artists of this period were influenced by the aesthetics of ancient sculpture, architecture, and painting, often striving for idealized forms and perfect proportions. One of the most prominent characteristics of neoclassical art is its focus on harmony and symmetry. Unlike the dynamic compositions of Baroque art, neoclassical works often feature balanced, orderly arrangements of figures and objects, with careful attention to geometric proportion. This desire for harmony was rooted in the belief that beauty could be found in the natural world and the principles of classical architecture, such as the use of columns, arches, and domes, which were replicated in art and design. Another defining feature of neoclassical art is its emphasis on the human form. Artists studied classical sculptures to create idealized, realistic depictions of the human body. Figures were often portrayed in strong, composed poses, with clean lines and smooth contours, reflecting both strength and grace. The subject matter of neoclassical art frequently drew from classical mythology, historical events, and allegorical themes, often with the intention of conveying moral lessons or civic virtue. These works celebrated heroism, virtue, and self-sacrifice, reflecting the Enlightenment ideals of rationality, morality, and social responsibility. In terms of color, neoclassical art favored a more restrained palette compared to the vibrant hues of the Rococo style. Artists used muted, earthy tones with an emphasis on natural light and shadow, allowing the forms to stand out with clarity and precision. There was a clear rejection of the excessive ornamentation and decorative flourishes seen in previous styles, focusing instead on a clean and unadorned aesthetic that highlighted the simplicity and nobility of the subjects. Additionally, neoclassical art was deeply influenced by the scientific and intellectual climate of the Enlightenment. It sought not only to capture beauty, but also to embody the ideals of reason, knowledge, and moral integrity. This intellectual depth is reflected in the artwork's focus on themes of civic duty, historical narratives, and moral allegories, aligning the movement with the philosophical and political currents of the time. In sum, neoclassical art was a pursuit of perfection in form, drawing inspiration from the classical past to reflect the values of the present. The role of archaeology and rediscovery of ancient art. The rediscovery of ancient art and the rise of archaeology played a pivotal role in the development of neoclassicism, shaping both its aesthetic and intellectual foundations. In the 18th century, a series of significant archaeological discoveries, particularly the excavation of the Roman cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum, reignited an interest in classical antiquity. These ancient cities, buried by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD, were rediscovered in the early 1700s, and the excavation efforts that followed revealed well-preserved frescoes, sculptures, and architectural remnants. This brought to light a wealth of visual culture that had remained hidden for centuries, offering a direct link to the ancient world. These discoveries had an immediate and profound effect on the art world. For the first time, artists and intellectuals were able to examine ancient Greek and Roman art in its original form, rather than through Renaissance or Baroque interpretations. The artifacts uncovered in Pompeii and Herculaneum provided a detailed and accurate understanding of ancient aesthetics, influencing artists to study the proportions, poses, and techniques of classical sculptures and frescoes. These influences were evident in the sharp lines, idealized human forms, and restrained compositions that defined neoclassical art. In addition to these archaeological finds, the broader intellectual climate of the Enlightenment also encouraged a revival of classical antiquity. Enlightenment thinkers, who emphasized reason and rationality, were drawn to the clarity and order that classical art represented. They saw in the art of ancient Greece and Rome an ideal of beauty that was rooted in mathematical precision and harmonious proportions, principles that resonated with the Enlightenment's belief in universal truths. For artists and architects, the study of ancient ruins was not only an exploration of aesthetic beauty, but also an intellectual pursuit, as they sought to emulate the moral and civic values embodied in classical culture. The influence of archaeology extended beyond painting and sculpture into architecture, where neoclassical designs were often inspired by the remains of ancient temples and public buildings. The columns, porticos, and symmetry found in Roman architecture became the hallmark of neoclassical structures, from grand public monuments to private homes. As artists and architects incorporated these classical elements into their work, they aligned themselves with the belief that art could both reflect and shape society's ideals. Ultimately, the rediscovery of ancient art through archaeology was crucial to the development of neoclassicism. It provided the visual and intellectual resources needed for a new artistic movement that sought to revive the beauty, order, and virtue of the classical world, offering a model for contemporary art, architecture, and culture. Comparison with Rococo and Baroque art. Neoclassicism emerged as a direct contrast to the elaborate, emotional styles of Baroque and Rococo art, both of which dominated European artistic expression before its rise. While Baroque and Rococo styles emphasized dynamism, extravagance, and emotional intensity, Neoclassicism sought simplicity, order, and rationality, returning to the ideals of classical antiquity. Baroque art, which flourished in the 17th century, was known for its dramatic use of light and shadow, vivid color contrasts, and emotional intensity. Artists like Caravaggio, Peter Paul Rubens, and Rembrandt used bold compositions to evoke strong emotional responses from viewers. Baroque works were often larger than life in scale, with subjects that conveyed grandeur, passion, and religious fervor. the style's ornamentation extended beyond visual art into architecture, where sweeping curves, intricate details, and a sense of movement were prominent. In contrast, neoclassical art emphasized calm, balanced compositions with clean lines and restrained color palettes that sought to create a sense of timelessness and reason rather than drama. Rococo, which followed the Baroque style in the 18th century, was characterized by its light, airy aesthetic and ornate decorations. It was often associated with the French aristocracy and the lavish lifestyle at the court of Louis XV. Rococo art featured pastel colors, delicate brushwork, and playful romantic themes, frequently portraying scenes of love, flirtation, and pleasure. Artists like Francois Boucher and Jean-Honoré Fragonard created works that celebrated beauty and sensuality, with an emphasis on elegance and whimsy. In stark contrast, neoclassical art rejected the frivolity of Rococo. Its subjects were more serious and moralistic, drawn from classical mythology, history, and allegory, often conveying themes of heroism, sacrifice, and civic virtue. The idealized human form, based on the study of ancient sculptures, replaced the soft, curvaceous figures common in Rococo. The shift from Baroque and Rococo to Neoclassicism was not only a matter of style, but also a reflection of the changing social and intellectual climate of the time. The Enlightenment's focus on reason, order, and progress influenced the neoclassical movement, which sought to reflect these ideals in art. While Baroque and Rococo art were rooted in emotion and excess, Neoclassicism looked to the restrained, balanced, and rational principles of classical art and architecture. Neoclassical artists sought to promote moral and civic virtues, aiming for art that could inspire reason and ethical action rather than indulgence or excess. Thus, the rise of neoclassicism represented a shift toward a more measured, intellectual approach to art, grounded in the ideals of antiquity and in contrast to the emotional and ornamental excesses of both Baroque and Rococo. Chapter 2: The Philosophical Foundations. The philosophical foundations of neoclassicism are deeply intertwined with the intellectual currents of the Enlightenment, which emphasized reason, individualism, and the belief in the transformative power of knowledge. The Enlightenment was a period of radical change in the way people thought about society, politics, and human nature. Philosophers such as John Locke, Immanuel Kant, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau challenged long-standing traditions, advocating for rational thought, empirical evidence, and the questioning of established authority. These ideas not only influenced politics and society, but also had a profound impact on the arts, where they gave rise to neoclassicism as an artistic movement that sought to embrace the principles of order, reason, and virtue. At the heart of neoclassicism was the belief that art should reflect the ideals of classical antiquity, which Enlightenment thinkers viewed as a perfect embodiment of reason and civic virtue. The ancient civilizations of Greece and Rome were seen as models for achieving a harmonious balance between beauty, intellect, and moral integrity. The Enlightenment philosophers argued that by returning to the aesthetic principles of classical art, modern society could correct the excesses and irrationalities of the Baroque and Rococo periods. Artists, architects, and writers who embraced neoclassicism believed that through a return to classical ideals, they could inspire the public to live virtuously, morally, and rationally. This philosophical perspective was rooted in the belief that beauty and truth were inherently connected. Classical art, with its emphasis on idealized proportions, balanced compositions, and harmonious forms, was seen as a reflection of universal truths that transcended time and culture. Artists sought to create works that not only embodied these ideals, but also conveyed moral and intellectual messages. The use of allegory, history, and mythology in neoclassical art often carried deep moral and civic lessons, encouraging viewers to reflect on values such as heroism, patriotism, and the pursuit of virtue. Moreover, the Enlightenment's belief in human progress and the power of reason was reflected in neoclassical art's focus on realism and clarity. Rather than relying on the exaggerated emotionalism of previous artistic movements, neoclassical artists aimed for accuracy, simplicity, and intellectual depth. They rejected the ornamental complexity of Rococo and Baroque art, striving instead for an aesthetic that was grounded in rationality and moral integrity. This philosophical foundation provided the intellectual framework for the neoclassical movement, which saw art as a vehicle for both beauty and social change. By turning to the classical world, Neoclassicism sought to inspire a new era of reason, virtue, and cultural enlightenment. The Enlightenment and rational thought. The Enlightenment, a philosophical movement that emerged in the 17th and 18th centuries, had a profound impact on the development of neoclassicism, particularly in its emphasis on rational thought, intellectual inquiry, and the rejection of traditional authority. Central to Enlightenment thinking was the belief that human reason could be the key to understanding the world and solving society's problems. This focus on reason and the scientific method provided the intellectual foundation for neoclassicism, which mirrored the Enlightenment's values of clarity, order, and balance. Enlightenment thinkers such as John Locke, Voltaire, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau challenged established doctrines, particularly those of religion, monarchy, and aristocracy. They advocated for the use of reason to improve society and promote individual liberty, equality, and justice. Rational thought, in their view, was the antidote to superstition, dogma, and irrationality. As these ideas spread, they significantly influenced not only politics and philosophy, but also art and culture. Neoclassical artists, inspired by the Enlightenment's embrace of reason, sought to create art that was rational, moral, and intellectually stimulating, rather than based on the emotional excesses or ornamental complexity of the Baroque and Rococo styles. In the context of neoclassicism, rational thought manifested in a renewed interest in the classical ideals of ancient Greece and Rome. The ancient world was seen as the pinnacle of reason and order, with its emphasis on proportion, harmony, and the pursuit of intellectual and civic virtues. Neoclassical artists admired the simplicity and clarity of classical art, which was based on balanced compositions, idealized human forms, and a focus on rational principles. This was in stark contrast to the ornate, emotion-driven works of the Baroque period, which had been characterized by dramatic contrasts and intense emotional expression. The Enlightenment's insistence on the importance of reason also influenced the way neoclassical art was perceived. Art was no longer seen solely as an avenue for emotional expression or religious devotion, but as a tool for educating the public and promoting social change. Artists like Jacques-Louis David used historical and allegorical subjects to convey moral lessons and inspire civic responsibility, often drawing on the themes of duty, virtue, and sacrifice. Neoclassical art, therefore, was seen as a reflection of the Enlightenment's belief that reason, knowledge, and the pursuit of virtue could lead to societal progress and the betterment of humanity. In this way, the Enlightenment's focus on rational thought and the rejection of traditional authority provided the philosophical underpinnings for neoclassicism, shaping it as a movement that championed intellectual clarity, moral virtue, and the power of reason to effect positive change. The role of antiquity in shaping modern ideas. The influence of antiquity, particularly ancient Greece and Rome, played a central role in shaping the intellectual and artistic landscape of the neoclassical movement. As the Enlightenment flourished in the 18th century, thinkers and artists looked back to the classical world as a model of reason, virtue, and civic engagement. The philosophical, political, and artistic ideals of antiquity provided a source of inspiration and a foundation for the development of modern ideas, bridging the gap between ancient wisdom and the intellectual advancements of the Enlightenment. Ancient Greece and Rome were seen as the epitome of rational governance, civic virtue, and intellectual achievement. Thinkers like Aristotle, Plato, and Cicero were revered for their contributions to philosophy, ethics, and political theory, which emphasized the importance of reason, justice, and the common good. The study of these classical philosophers greatly influenced the development of modern political thought, especially in relation to ideas about democracy, governance, and the rights of individuals. The principles of republicanism and citizenship, as practiced in ancient Rome, also resonated deeply with Enlightenment thinkers, who saw in them a model for an ideal society based on equality, liberty, and the rule of law. In the visual arts, the rediscovery of classical works through archaeological excavations played a significant role in shaping modern aesthetics. The study of ancient sculptures, frescoes, and architecture informed the neoclassical emphasis on harmony, proportion, and simplicity. Artists sought to emulate the idealized human forms found in ancient sculptures, favoring clean lines and balanced compositions. This focus on proportion and symmetry was rooted in classical principles that celebrated the beauty and strength of the human body, which was seen as a reflection of moral and intellectual virtue. The human form, idealized and perfect in its proportions, became a symbol of the rational, disciplined values that Neoclassicism sought to embody. The revival of classical antiquity also had a profound impact on literature and education, influencing the way ideas were communicated and understood. The works of ancient historians, playwrights, and poets, such as Homer, Sophocles, and Virgil, were not only celebrated for their artistic achievements, but also revered for their moral teachings. These ancient texts were used as educational tools, shaping the development of modern ideas about morality, heroism, and civic duty. The moral and philosophical lessons derived from these classical works provided a framework for understanding human nature and society, helping to inform the Enlightenment's ideals of rationality and social progress. In essence, antiquity served as a powerful source of inspiration for the neoclassical movement, influencing not just the visual arts, but also modern philosophical, political, and educational ideas. The values of reason, virtue, and civic duty found in the ancient world became the foundation for the intellectual and cultural advancements of the Enlightenment, marking a crucial moment in the evolution of modern thought. The pursuit of ideals, truth, virtue, and reason. At the heart of Neoclassicism lies a profound commitment to the pursuit of ideals, particularly the ideals of truth, virtue, and reason, which were deeply embedded in the philosophical foundations of the Enlightenment. This artistic movement was not simply about aesthetic beauty, but also a reflection of the broader intellectual currents of the time, which sought to elevate the human spirit through rational thought and moral action. In this sense, neoclassical art was a means to communicate these ideals visually, encouraging viewers to aspire to higher moral and intellectual standards. The concept of truth in neoclassical art was grounded in the belief that art should reflect reality, but not just in a literal sense. Rather, artists sought to depict universal truths about human nature, society, and the moral values that governed life. By returning to the classical forms of ancient Greece and Rome, artists found inspiration in the idealized, yet realistic representations of the human body and mind. This approach emphasized proportion, balance, and harmony as expressions of natural truth, capturing the essence of human existence in its most perfected form. In this way, truth was seen not just in the accurate representation of the world, but in the pursuit of higher ideals that transcended the imperfections of the everyday. Virtue was another central ideal in neoclassical art, often portrayed through subjects drawn from history, mythology, or allegory. Artists sought to inspire viewers by presenting figures who embodied moral strength, courage, and self-discipline. The works of artists such as Jacques-Louis David, who depicted historical figures such as the Roman senator Brutus or the Greek hero Socrates, were infused with moral messages, demonstrating the importance of personal sacrifice, civic duty, and ethical behavior. Neoclassical art, through its emphasis on virtuous actions, encouraged society to reflect on the moral standards of the time and to seek a life governed by principles of integrity and honor. Reason, perhaps the most significant value of the Enlightenment, was likewise central to the neoclassical movement. Enlightenment thinkers believed that reason was the key to understanding the world and improving society. Artists, in turn, sought to embody these principles of rationality through their compositions. The balanced and symmetrical forms of neoclassical art were designed to create an intellectual experience that appealed to reason, offering clarity and order, in contrast to the chaos and excesses of previous artistic movements like Baroque and Rococo. For artists, reason was not just a philosophical ideal, but a guide to creating works that were both intellectually and aesthetically satisfying. In sum, the pursuit of truth, virtue, and reason was central to the neoclassical movement, providing not just a visual style, but a framework for living according to the Enlightenment ideals of moral and intellectual progress. Through its focus on these timeless ideals, neoclassical art sought to inspire a new era of rational thought, ethical conduct, and artistic excellence. Philosophical influences: John Locke, Immanuel Kant, and others. The philosophical underpinnings of Neoclassicism were deeply shaped by the intellectual currents of the Enlightenment, with key thinkers such as John Locke, Immanuel Kant, and other prominent philosophers influencing the way artists approached their work and society's ideals. These philosophers emphasized reason, individualism, and the importance of moral and intellectual progress, values that were central to the neoclassical movement's pursuit of truth, virtue, and reason. John Locke, an English philosopher known for his work on empiricism and political theory, was a significant influence on the Enlightenment's intellectual climate. Locke's philosophy argued that human knowledge was derived from experience, and he emphasized the importance of reason in shaping the mind. This emphasis on reason and the capacity of humans to learn and understand the world resonated with neoclassical artists who sought to elevate rational thought through their works. Locke's belief in the rights of individuals, particularly in his advocacy for the separation of church and state and the protection of private property, also aligned with the neoclassical focus on the individual's role in society, civic virtue, and moral integrity. Immanuel Kant, another towering figure of the Enlightenment, introduced concepts that also deeply impacted neoclassical thought. Kant's ideas on aesthetics and morality, particularly his belief in the power of reason to guide moral action, were central to the intellectual environment in which neoclassical artists operated. Kant's critique of judgment argued that beauty was not just subjective, but could be understood through universal principles of harmony and proportion, aligning closely with the neoclassical emphasis on idealized forms and balance in art. Kant's moral philosophy also emphasized autonomy, reason, and the pursuit of moral duty, all of which were reflected in the allegorical and historical subjects of neoclassical art, which sought to portray virtuous actions and self-discipline as the ideal. Other thinkers, such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Voltaire, further contributed to the philosophical environment that shaped neoclassicism. Rousseau's ideas on the social contract and the importance of civic virtue resonated with artists who depicted historical figures and events that celebrated collective action and moral responsibility. Voltaire's advocacy for reason and criticism of religious dogma also aligned with neoclassical values, as artists and intellectuals sought to challenge the excesses of Baroque and Rococo art, which they saw as overly emotional and irrational. In conclusion, the philosophies of thinkers like Locke, Kant, Rousseau, and Voltaire played a significant role in shaping the ideals of neoclassicism. Their emphasis on reason, morality, and the importance of individual and civic responsibility resonated with artists who sought to create works that were intellectually and morally uplifting, reflecting the intellectual optimism of the Enlightenment. Neoclassicism and political revolution. Neoclassicism was not just an artistic movement, it was deeply intertwined with the political revolutions of the 18th and early 19th centuries. The Enlightenment's ideals of reason, liberty, and progress directly influenced political changes, including the American and French revolutions. In these contexts, neoclassical art became a powerful tool for expressing revolutionary ideals, promoting the virtues of democracy, civic responsibility, and the rights of individuals. The movement's focus on classical antiquity, which celebrated republicanism and civic virtue, resonated with the political aspirations of the time. The French Revolution, in particular, had a strong connection to neoclassicism. The revolutionaries saw themselves as heirs to the values of ancient Greece and Rome, especially the Roman Republic, which was viewed as a model of civic engagement, political freedom, and the rejection of monarchical rule. Neoclassical artists, influenced by these ideals, portrayed historical events and figures that symbolized the virtues of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Works by artists like Jacques-Louis David, who was both a prominent neoclassical painter and a supporter of the revolution, captured these themes. His famous painting, The Oath of the Horatti, was an emblematic work, showing Roman citizens swearing an oath of loyalty to the state. This was interpreted as a call to arms for revolutionary France, highlighting themes of patriotism and civic duty. The use of neoclassical imagery during the French Revolution was not only about artistic style, but also about the political message embedded in the works. The classical references to ancient republicanism were a deliberate attempt to connect contemporary political struggles with the moral and civic values of antiquity. The ideals of the French Revolution were reflected in the heroic poses, noble gestures, and stoic expressions of the figures in neoclassical art, emphasizing the sacrifice and commitment required for the establishment of a new just society. Similarly, in America, the ideals of neoclassicism influenced the architecture and visual culture of the newly formed United States. The Founding Fathers, inspired by classical Republican ideals, sought to build a nation that reflected the democratic principles of ancient Greece and Rome. The neoclassical architecture of buildings like the White House and the U.S. Capitol was meant to evoke the grandeur and democratic ideals of the Roman Republic. Artists and architects drew on classical forms and structures to create a visual language that reinforced the new nation's commitment to liberty and republicanism. In essence, Neoclassicism's association with political revolution was not merely aesthetic, but ideological. Its emphasis on classical ideals of democracy, virtue, and civic duty aligned perfectly with the revolutionary spirit of the time, helping to shape the visual language of political change and providing a moral framework for the establishment of new democratic societies. Chapter 3: The Major Artists of Neoclassicism. The neoclassical movement was marked by the contributions of several key artists who sought to revive the ideals of classical antiquity through their work. These artists were not only committed to the aesthetic principles of harmony, proportion, and balance, but they also used their art as a means to express the political and intellectual ideals of the Enlightenment. Among the most prominent figures of neoclassicism were Jacques-Louis David, Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, Antonio Canova, and Horace Vernet, each of whom played a significant role in shaping the movement and its legacy. Jacques-Louis David, often regarded as the most influential artist of the neoclassical period, was a key figure in both the art world and the political landscape of revolutionary France. David's work epitomized the neoclassical commitment to moral and civic virtue, with his paintings often drawing on classical history and mythology to convey messages of sacrifice, duty, and patriotism. His iconic work, The Oath of the Horatti, exemplified these themes, showcasing the valor of Roman citizens pledging allegiance to the state. David's revolutionary fervor was reflected in his support of the French Revolution, and his art became a tool for conveying revolutionary ideals. His other works, such as The Death of Socrates and Napoleon Crossing the Alps, depicted heroic figures engaged in moral and political action, cementing David as the artist of revolutionary France. Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, a student of David, carried the neoclassical tradition forward while also incorporating elements of Romanticism. Ingres was known for his precise technique, idealized depictions of the human body, and his emphasis on line and form. His paintings, such as Le Grand Odalisque and the Apotheosis of Homer, blended neoclassical themes with a more sensual approach to the human figure, though still grounded in classical ideals of beauty and proportion. Ingres' works reflected a deep understanding of classical art, and his refined technique made him one of the most respected figures of his time. Antonio Canova, an Italian sculptor, was another key figure of the neoclassical movement. Known for his marble sculptures, Canova's work epitomized the neoclassical emphasis on idealized forms and classical subjects. His sculptures, such as Psyche Revived by Cupid's Kiss and The Three Graces, showcased his mastery of the human form and his ability to capture both grace and emotion in marble. Canova's works drew heavily on classical mythology, often depicting gods, goddesses, and mythological heroes, and his sculptures were widely admired for their refinement and beauty. Horace Vernet, though less well-known than David or Ingres, was another important neoclassical artist. His historical paintings, often depicting military scenes, celebrated heroic action and the triumph of the human spirit. Vernet's work was infused with a sense of grandeur and nobility, drawing from both the classical and the contemporary to portray figures of courage and determination. These artists, along with many others, helped define the neoclassical movement by embracing the principles of classical art and using their work to communicate the values of the Enlightenment. Through their mastery of form, technique, and subject matter, they not only revived the ideals of antiquity, but also contributed to the political and intellectual changes that defined their era. Jacques-Louis David, the father of Neoclassicism. Jacques-Louis David is widely regarded as the father of Neoclassicism, a title that reflects his profound influence on the development of the movement and its ideals. His work was not just a revival of classical art, but also an embodiment of the political and moral ideals of the time. David's commitment to depicting historical and mythological themes through a lens of virtue, patriotism, and rationality made him a central figure in both the artistic and political spheres of his era. His ability to merge classical aesthetics with revolutionary ideals cemented his legacy as the most important artist of neoclassical art. David's early training under the influence of the Rococo style gave way to his eventual embrace of neoclassical principles after his study of classical antiquity, which was deeply informed by the growing Enlightenment emphasis on reason, clarity, and moral values. He drew inspiration from the art and philosophy of ancient Greece and Rome, and his work often centered on themes of duty, sacrifice, and honor. His commitment to these ideals is most evident in his famous painting, The Oath of the Horatii, 1784, which depicted three Roman brothers swearing an oath to defend their country, even at the cost of their lives. The painting's sharp lines, restrained color palette, and heroic subject matter became a visual manifesto for the values of the Enlightenment and the political atmosphere of pre-revolutionary France. David's work was not only admired for its technical brilliance, but also for its political significance. His support for the French Revolution shaped much of his later work, as he sought to use his art as a tool for revolutionary propaganda. He famously painted The Death of Socrates, 1787, a piece that depicted the philosopher's stoic acceptance of death, symbolizing the virtues of self-sacrifice and loyalty to one's principles. His painting Napoleon Crossing the Alps, 1801, further solidified his role as an official court artist during Napoleon's reign, portraying the emperor as a heroic figure akin to the great leaders of antiquity. David's influence extended far beyond his paintings. He was a mentor to many younger artists, shaping the direction of French art in the early 19th century and establishing the foundation for neoclassical art throughout Europe. His embrace of classical ideals in both form and subject matter, coupled with his deep engagement with the political movements of his time, made him a powerful figure in shaping the cultural landscape of the era. David's legacy as the father of Neoclassicism is firmly rooted in his ability to bridge the worlds of art, politics, and philosophy, using his work to inspire and reflect the intellectual and political currents of the Enlightenment and revolutionary France. Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, the classicist portraitist. Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres stands as one of the most influential figures in the development of Neoclassicism, particularly within the realm of portraiture. While he was deeply rooted in the principles of classical art, Ingres also sought to explore the boundaries of idealism and realism, blending the technical precision of the classical tradition with an evolving sense of personal expression. His dedication to classical forms and meticulous attention to detail made him a quintessential neoclassical artist, earning him a lasting reputation as a master portraitist. Ingres was trained under the guidance of Jacques-Louis David, the central figure of the neoclassical movement. David's influence on Ingres was evident, especially in the latter's commitment to the balanced and harmonious forms drawn from classical art. Ingres, however, began to develop his own distinctive style that, while rooted in neoclassicism, also displayed a more sensual, fluid interpretation of the human form. This is most apparent in his celebrated work, La Grande Odalisque, 1814, where he reinterprets the classical female nude by presenting an idealized, elongated figure that emphasizes sensuality and elegance. While still adhering to classical standards of beauty, Ingres' attention to delicate detail and the sensuality of his figures marked a divergence from the more restrained approach of David. In his portrait work, Ingres exhibited the same rigor and precision that defined his broader artistic practice. His portraits, such as the portrait of Madame Moitessier, 1851, and Louis-François Bertin, 1832, are notable not only for their impeccable technique, but also for their ability to capture the psychological depth of their subjects. Unlike many of his contemporaries who sought to inject emotion or drama into their portraits, Ingres focused on a calm, dignified presence, often using classical poses and settings to reinforce the status and gravitas of his subjects. His portraits reveal a mastery of capturing texture, especially in fabrics and skin tones, and a keen sense of refinement that aligned with the ideals of neoclassical portraiture. While Ingres' work remained within the classical tradition, he was also a transitional figure in the history of art, straddling the end of the neoclassical period and the rise of Romanticism. His later works exhibited a greater emphasis on emotional expression, though still framed by his adherence to classical proportions and order. His complex relationship with the evolving artistic trends of the 19th century underscored his role in the broader narrative of European art. Through his portraits and history paintings, Ingres cemented his place as one of the great classicists of his time. His ability to blend technical mastery with an evolving sensibility made him not only a pivotal artist within neoclassicism, but also an important figure in the transition toward modern art. Antonio Canova, master of neoclassical sculpture. Antonio Canova is widely celebrated as one of the greatest sculptors of the neoclassical movement, revered for his technical mastery, refined elegance, and ability to breathe life into marble. His works exemplify the neoclassical dedication to idealized beauty, harmony, and proportion, while also reflecting the era's intellectual and cultural values. Canova's sculptures embody the principles of classical antiquity, yet they also demonstrate a unique sensitivity to human emotion and form, making him a key figure in the development of Western sculpture. Born in Italy in 1757, Canova's early training and exposure to classical art deeply influenced his artistic style. He was drawn to the works of ancient Greek and Roman sculptures, which he studied extensively. Canova's ability to recreate the human body with a sense of naturalism while adhering to classical ideals of beauty became his trademark. His work reflects a deep understanding of human anatomy and an almost obsessive attention to detail, which allowed him to capture the intricacies of the human form with incredible accuracy. One of Canova's most famous works, Psyche Revived by Cupid's Kiss, 1787, showcases his signature style, perfectly smooth marble surfaces and an almost ethereal sense of lightness and grace. The sculpture depicts the mythological story of Psyche, whose lifeless body is revived by Cupid's kiss. Canova's exquisite treatment of the marble makes the figures appear almost weightless, evoking a sense of tenderness and sensuality that is in perfect harmony with the neoclassical ideals of beauty and virtue. This combination of classical subject matter with a heightened emotional sensitivity helped distinguish Canova's work from other sculptors of the period. Another of Canova's masterpieces, The Three Graces, 1814 to 1817, also epitomizes his refined approach to neoclassical sculpture. This sculpture depicts three female figures in a harmonious embrace, symbolizing beauty, charm, and creativity. The graceful positioning of the figures, combined with the smooth, almost translucent quality of the marble, conveys a sense of unity and balance, while also highlighting Canova's technical prowess. His ability to transform the cold, rigid material of marble into forms that seem soft and full of life was unmatched in his time. Canova's success and international fame allowed him to work for royalty and aristocracy throughout Europe, creating portraits and sculptures of mythological figures, gods, and heroes. His work embodied the ideals of the neoclassical period, celebrating the human form and classical mythology, while also adding a level of emotional depth and sensitivity that was ahead of its time. Through his devotion to classical aesthetics and his unrivaled skill, Antonio Canova left an indelible mark on the world of sculpture, making him a central figure in the history of Neoclassicism and one of its greatest masters. His ability to capture both the beauty and emotion of the human experience remains a lasting testament to his genius. Other prominent artists: Angelica Kauffman, Horace Vernet, and more. While Jacques-Louis David, Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, and Antonio Canova are often seen as the foremost figures in neoclassicism, many other artists also contributed significantly to the movement, helping to shape its development and spread its ideals across Europe. Among these artists were Angelica Kauffman, Horace Vernet, and others, each of whom brought their own unique approach to neoclassical art, expanding the movement's reach into different genres and regions. Angelica Kauffman, an Austrian-born artist, was one of the most prominent female painters of the neoclassical period. She was an accomplished portraitist, history painter, and a founding member of the Royal Academy in London. Kauffman's work exemplified the neoclassical ideals of clarity, order, and moral virtue. Her portraits often depicted sitters with an air of dignity and grace, while her history paintings, such as Cornelia, Mother of the Gracchi, 1785, celebrated classical virtues such as maternal devotion and civic duty. Kauffman's ability to portray both the nobility of character and the beauty of classical forms made her a respected figure in her time. She was highly regarded for her technical skill and ability to capture the emotional depth of her subjects, gaining fame across Europe, particularly in England and Italy. Horace Vernet, a French painter, was another important contributor to the neoclassical movement, especially known for his historical and military scenes. His work celebrated the ideals of heroism, bravery, and patriotism, aligning with the neoclassical focus on the dignity of the human spirit and the moral lessons of history. Vernet's scenes of military campaigns, such as the Battle of the Nile, 1827, depicted both the drama of battle and the nobility of the soldiers involved. His compositions often combined realistic details with classical themes, showcasing the heroic nature of warfare and the sacrifices made in the name of liberty and justice. Though Vernet's work has sometimes been categorized as more romantic in its dramatic intensity, it still remained rooted in the moral and intellectual ideals of neoclassicism, especially in his emphasis on noble action and historical events. In addition to Kauffman and Vernet, other artists such as Jean-Baptiste Regnault, François-André Vincent, and Pierre Narcisse Guérin also contributed to the neoclassical movement. each bringing a unique interpretation of classical subjects and ideals. Regnault, known for his historical paintings, explored themes of ancient mythology and history, while Guérin's works often focused on subjects from the French Revolution and classical antiquity. These artists helped to expand the movement's reach beyond the boundaries of France, creating a visual language that celebrated the values of the Enlightenment and the cultural legacy of ancient Greece and Rome. Together, these artists formed a rich and diverse network of creators who contributed to the flourishing of neoclassical art. While some focused on history and mythology, others found ways to explore the human experience through portraiture, allegory, and even military subjects. Their work collectively helped define an era, capturing the intellectual, political, and artistic currents of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Influence of the Grand Tour on artists. The Grand Tour, a cultural and educational journey undertaken by young European aristocrats in the 17th and 18th centuries, played a significant role in shaping the neoclassical movement. Typically spanning Italy, France, and other parts of Europe, the Grand Tour exposed travelers to the rich history, art, and architecture of the classical world. For artists, the Grand Tour provided a profound opportunity to study the ancient ruins, Renaissance art, and classical masterpieces that would later influence their own works. It became a rite of passage for many aspiring artists, contributing to the revival of classical ideals that defined Neoclassicism. One of the most significant impacts of the Grand Tour on artists was its focus on the study of classical antiquity. Artists visiting Rome, Naples, and other ancient sites were exposed to the ruins of the Roman Empire, including the Colosseum, the Pantheon, and Pompeii, which inspired a deep appreciation for classical forms and principles. The study of ancient sculpture, architecture, and frescoes helped artists refine their understanding of proportion, perspective, and idealized human figures, which they then incorporated into their own works. The exposure to these timeless works of art encouraged a return to the classical style, influencing not only their artistic techniques, but also the subjects and themes they chose to depict. For many artists, the Grand Tour also provided access to private collections and the opportunity to engage with contemporary intellectuals, collectors, and art patrons. The art collections of wealthy families and museums, such as the Vatican Museums, became vital sources of inspiration for artists seeking to reconnect with the classical past. By studying works by ancient masters, as well as Renaissance artists who had revived classical ideals, artists learned how to balance realism with idealism, an essential characteristic of neoclassical art. The Grand Tour fostered a greater sense of historical awareness among artists, many of whom chose to depict scenes from ancient history, mythology, and Roman culture in their works. For instance, artists like Johann Zoffany and Gavin Hamilton were known for their historical and mythological paintings that reflected their experiences and studies during their grand tours. Zoffany's The Tribuna of the Uffizi, 1772 to 1773, for example, depicts a collection of classical sculptures and paintings in the Uffizi Gallery, encapsulating the profound influence of the Grand Tour on both the artists and the intellectual elite. In addition to its impact on artistic subjects, the Grand Tour also encouraged the creation of art that had a distinctly European, cosmopolitan flair. As artists traveled and studied together, they shared ideas, techniques, and cultural experiences, which helped to unify the artistic landscape of Europe during the 18th century. The influence of the Grand Tour not only shaped the works of individual artists, but also contributed to the spread of neoclassical ideals, which would come to define the artistic and cultural ethos of the period. Chapter 4: Neoclassical Architecture. Neoclassical architecture, like its artistic counterpart, sought to revive the principles of classical antiquity, particularly the grand structures of ancient Greece and Rome. Emerging in the mid-18th century as a response to the ornate and elaborate Baroque and Rococo styles, neoclassical architecture embraced simplicity, symmetry, and the use of classical elements such as columns, domes, and porticos. This architectural movement reflected the ideals of the Enlightenment, emphasizing reason, order, and harmony, and sought to create buildings that were both functional and aesthetically pleasing. A key characteristic of neoclassical architecture is its emphasis on clarity and restraint. Architects rejected the excesses of the Baroque and Rococo, instead focusing on the clean lines and proportions found in classical buildings. The use of columns inspired by the Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian orders of ancient Greece and Rome became a defining feature of neoclassical design. These columns were often used to frame entrances or to support porticos, creating a sense of grandeur and monumentality. Additionally, the incorporation of pediments, triangular gables that crowned doors or windows, further invoked classical design elements and added to the sense of order and balance that was central to the movement. Another important aspect of neoclassical architecture was the use of symmetry. Buildings were often designed with a clear axial alignment, with doors, windows, and other features arranged in perfect symmetry to create a balanced, harmonious structure. This focus on symmetry reflected the Enlightenment ideals of rationality and order, with the aim of creating spaces that were not only visually appealing, but also intellectually satisfying. The movement's roots in classical antiquity were reinforced by the growing interest in archaeology and the rediscovery of ancient ruins, particularly in Italy and Greece. As artists and architects visited these ancient sites, they drew inspiration from the buildings they encountered, incorporating elements like grand staircases, open courtyards, and monumental facades into their own designs. The excavation of Pompeii and Herculaneum, as well as the study of classical texts, fueled this renewed interest in the classical past, leading to the widespread adoption of neoclassical styles in public and private buildings alike. Some of the most iconic examples of neoclassical architecture include the Pantheon in Paris, designed by Jacques-Germain Soufflot, and the United States Capitol in Washington, D.C., designed by William Thornton. These buildings demonstrate the fusion of classical principles with the needs and aspirations of the modern era. Neoclassical architecture was not just about replicating ancient forms, but also about adapting them to contemporary contexts, creating structures that symbolize both civic pride and intellectual progress. In many ways, neoclassical architecture embodied the spirit of the Enlightenment, reflecting the desire for clarity, simplicity, and rationality in a world that was increasingly questioning traditional authority. Through its emphasis on classical forms and its embrace of symmetry, order, and proportion, neoclassical architecture became a powerful expression of the cultural and intellectual ideals of the time, leaving a lasting impact on the architectural landscape of Europe and America. Revival of classical Greek and Roman forms. The revival of classical Greek and Roman forms in neoclassical architecture was one of the most defining characteristics of the movement, reflecting the intellectual and cultural currents of the Enlightenment. As artists and architects turned to antiquity for inspiration, they sought to emulate the purity, simplicity, and harmony of ancient structures, viewing them as embodiments of idealized beauty and rational design. This return to classical ideals was not simply a superficial imitation of ancient forms, but rather a thoughtful adaptation of their principles to contemporary needs and values. One of the most significant aspects of this revival was the adoption of the classical orders, Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian, as a guiding framework for architecture. These columnar styles, which originated in ancient Greece and were later refined by the Romans, became a central feature of neoclassical design. The Doric order, with its sturdy, simple columns, conveyed strength and masculinity, while the more decorative Ionic and Corinthian orders represented grace and elegance. These columns were used not just as structural elements, but also as symbols of classical ideals, providing a sense of order and dignity to buildings. Architects of the neoclassical period also drew inspiration from the grand public buildings of ancient Rome, such as the Pantheon and the Colosseum. The use of domes, porticos, and colonnades became a hallmark of the style, designed to evoke the monumental scale and grandeur of Roman architecture. Domes, in particular, symbolized the unity and vastness of the cosmos, while porticos served as formal entrances that provided both a symbolic and functional gateway into the building. In addition to structural elements, neoclassical architects embraced the layout and spatial organization of ancient buildings. Like the Greeks and Romans, they focused on symmetry, proportion, and balance in their designs. Buildings were often laid out with a clear axial alignment, with elements such as doors, windows, and columns arranged in a deliberate and harmonious manner. This attention to proportion was guided by the belief that well-proportioned buildings created a sense of harmony and order, reflecting the rational thought that defined the Enlightenment. The revival of classical forms was also influenced by the growing interest in archaeology during the 18th century. The excavation of ancient Roman and Greek sites, such as Pompeii and Herculaneum, sparked a renewed fascination with the ancient world. Architects and artists studied these ruins closely, learning from the ancient structures' innovative engineering and aesthetic qualities. This engagement with the past helped ensure that the revival of classical forms was both informed by historical accuracy and imbued with a deeper understanding of classical principles. In neoclassical architecture, the revival of Greek and Roman forms became a powerful expression of the era's intellectual and cultural aspirations. It was seen as a way to connect the present with a revered past, emphasizing values like reason, order, and beauty, while also reinforcing the growing sense of nationalism and civic pride. Through their careful study and adaptation of classical architecture, neoclassical architects were able to create buildings that symbolized the intellectual progress and moral clarity of their time, leaving a lasting legacy on the architectural landscape. Key architectural features: columns, domes, and symmetry. In neoclassical architecture, certain key features stood out as essential elements in creating the style's signature look. Columns, domes, and symmetry were among the most prominent, each playing a crucial role in giving neoclassical buildings their sense of grandeur, order, and connection to classical antiquity. These architectural elements not only reflected the aesthetic preferences of the time, but also embodied the Enlightenment ideals of reason, clarity, and proportion. Columns, one of the most iconic features of neoclassical architecture, were borrowed directly from the classical orders of ancient Greece and Rome. The use of Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian columns was central to the style, with each order bringing its own character and symbolism to the design. The Doric column, with its simple, sturdy form, conveyed strength and stability, while the Ionic column, more slender and elegant, represented grace and refinement. The Corinthian column, characterized by its ornate capitals adorned with acanthus leaves, brought an air of sophistication and luxury. These columns were not merely decorative, but also structural, serving as supports for porticos, helping to create a sense of monumentality and permanence. Their repetition in building facades reinforced the principles of balance and harmony. Domes were another defining feature of neoclassical architecture. Drawing inspiration from ancient Roman structures such as the Pantheon, the dome became a symbol of the vastness of the universe and human intellect. The inclusion of a dome in a building signified not only architectural mastery, but also the ambition of the Enlightenment period to encompass knowledge and reason within a unified space. The dome's round shape evoked ideas of celestial harmony, while its structural innovation showcased the era's advances in engineering. One of the best examples of neoclassical domes is the Pantheon in Paris, designed by Jacques Germain Soufflot, which integrated a massive dome supported by an equally impressive colonnade, embodying both classical beauty and engineering prowess. Symmetry was perhaps the most critical and fundamental feature of neoclassical architecture. This emphasis on balanced proportions reflected the Enlightenment's ideals of rationality and order. Buildings were designed with precise axial alignments, where every element, from windows and doors to columns and decorative motifs, was arranged symmetrically along a central axis. This organization not only provided visual harmony, but also symbolized the rational, methodical thinking that dominated intellectual life during the period. The idea of symmetry extended beyond facades and into the layout of entire buildings, with large public spaces and interiors designed to echo the same sense of balance and harmony found in the exterior architecture. Together, columns, domes, and symmetry formed the backbone of neoclassical architecture, creating buildings that were visually striking, symbolically rich, and philosophically grounded in the values of classical antiquity and Enlightenment thought. These architectural features helped bridge the past with the present, ensuring that neoclassical buildings would stand as both aesthetic achievements and embodiments of the intellectual ideals of the time. Notable neoclassical buildings: the Pantheon in Paris, the White House. Among the many remarkable examples of neoclassical architecture, two buildings stand out for their historical significance and embodiment of the style's ideals: the Pantheon in Paris and the White House in Washington, D.C. Both of these iconic structures reflect the cultural and intellectual aspirations of their respective nations, using classical forms and symbolism to convey ideals of reason, civic virtue, and national identity. The Pantheon, originally conceived as a church, was designed by the French architect Jacques-Germain Soufflot and completed in 1790. This monumental building stands as a testament to the neoclassical movement's embrace of classical Roman forms. The Pantheon's most striking feature is its vast dome, which was inspired by the ancient Roman Pantheon and symbolizes the unity of the French nation under the banner of reason and enlightenment. The building's exterior is dominated by a colonnade of Corinthian columns, emphasizing the classical ideals of symmetry, harmony, and grandeur. The design reflects the Enlightenment's belief in rationality and progress, with the Pantheon eventually repurposed as a mausoleum for French national heroes, such as Voltaire, Rousseau, Victor Hugo, and Émile Zola. Its transformation from a church to a secular temple mirrors the intellectual and political shifts of the time, particularly the French Revolution, which sought to distance the nation from religious authority and embrace the ideals of citizenship, human rights, and reason. The White House, designed by James Hoban and completed in 1800, is another important neoclassical building, albeit with distinctly American political and cultural symbolism. Inspired by classical European architecture, the White House combines elements of Georgian and neoclassical styles, featuring a simple, symmetrical facade, a columned portico, and a central dome that evokes the grandeur of classical public buildings. Its design reflects the Founding Fathers' desire to create a building that would symbolize the ideals of the new American Republic: democracy, republicanism, and a commitment to Enlightenment values. The White House's classical form was intended to link the United States with the traditions of ancient Greece and Rome, evoking the strength and rationality of these civilizations, while also signaling a break from the monarchical traditions of Europe. As the residence of the U.S. president, the White House has become not just a symbol of governmental power, but also an enduring representation of the democratic principles upon which the nation was founded. Both the Pantheon and the White House stand as monuments to the neoclassical style's power to shape national identities. Their designs reflect the intellectual currents of their time, embracing classical forms to communicate ideals of unity, progress, and civic virtue. These buildings, through their architectural splendor, continue to serve as symbols of their respective nations' cultural heritage and philosophical foundations. Role of architects: Robert Adam, Thomas Jefferson, and others. The neoclassical architectural movement was shaped not only by the intellectual currents of the Enlightenment, but also by the contributions of individual architects who embraced classical forms and sought to integrate them into contemporary designs. Among these architects, Robert Adam and Thomas Jefferson stand out as pivotal figures, with each playing a significant role in popularizing the neoclassical style in their respective countries. Their work, along with that of other notable architects, helped define the neoclassical aesthetic, blending classical ideals with modern needs and aspirations. Robert Adam, a Scottish architect, was one of the most influential figures in the development of neoclassical architecture in Britain. Known for his refined and elegant designs, Adam's work combined the principles of classical antiquity with a distinctive flair for interior decoration. He was particularly renowned for his use of Roman and Greek elements in domestic architecture, with his designs often incorporating symmetrical facades, columns, and classical detailing. Adam's interiors were equally important to his legacy, as he introduced innovative design elements such as stucco ceilings, ornamental plasterwork, and classical motifs in furniture and decor. His most famous work, the design of the interiors of Kenwood House in London, exemplifies his talent for combining architectural grandeur with functional domesticity, creating spaces that were both refined and comfortable. Adam's ability to blend classical influences with a unique British sensibility made him a leading figure in the neoclassical movement, influencing generations of architects. In the United States, Thomas Jefferson played a similarly crucial role in promoting neoclassical architecture, particularly in the design of public buildings. As an architect and the third president of the United States, Jefferson saw architecture as a means to express the ideals of the newly formed republic. Jefferson's most famous architectural achievement is the design of his own home, Monticello, which combines elements of Palladianism and Neoclassicism to create a building that symbolizes both classical ideals and American independence. His design for the Virginia state capitol, influenced by the Roman temple of Fortuna Virilis, became a model for many state houses and government buildings across the United States. Jefferson believed that the classical style reflected the democratic values of the ancient Greeks and Romans and was a fitting expression of the young nation's commitment to reason, equality, and republicanism. Other architects, such as James Hoban, who designed the White House, and Charles Bulfinch, known for his work on the Massachusetts State House, also contributed to the spread of neoclassical architecture in the United States. These architects drew inspiration from European examples, but adapted them to the new political and cultural context of the American Republic. Together, these architects helped shape the neoclassical movement by blending classical forms with contemporary concerns, creating buildings that were not only aesthetically pleasing, but also charged with symbolic meaning. Through their work, neoclassical architecture became a powerful tool for expressing the cultural, political, and intellectual aspirations of the period, leaving a lasting imprint on the architectural landscape of both Europe and America. Neoclassicism in public versus private buildings. Neoclassical architecture was widely applied in both public and private buildings, though the approach and intent behind its use differed between the two. While the neoclassical style in public buildings was often used to convey ideals of power, democracy, and civic virtue, its use in private homes was focused more on aesthetics, comfort, and the demonstration of personal taste and cultural awareness. The classical elements adopted in both contexts, such as columns, symmetry, and grand facades, were used as symbols of order, rationality, and cultural sophistication. In public architecture, neoclassical designs were adopted to express the political and philosophical ideals of the time, especially in the wake of the Enlightenment. Governments, particularly in revolutionary France and the United States, embraced neoclassical forms to create buildings that symbolized the aspirations of the Republic, democracy, and the civic virtues of ancient Greece and Rome. The monumental scale of these buildings, as well as the use of columns, domes, and large porticos, was intended to project a sense of stability and permanence, aligning the new governments with the grandeur and rationality of the classical past. Buildings like the Pantheon in Paris and the United States Capitol in Washington, D.C., were designed not only as functional spaces, but also as symbols of national identity, uniting the present with the ideals of ancient civilizations. Neoclassical architecture in these public buildings was meant to inspire respect and admiration, reminding citizens of the shared cultural values of their nations. In contrast, neoclassical architecture in private buildings, particularly in residential homes, often focused on creating a refined and elegant environment for the wealthy elite. While still drawing from classical principles, the application of neoclassical style in private homes was often more restrained and focused on creating harmonious, well-proportioned spaces. The use of columns, pediments, and symmetrical facades in these buildings emphasized elegance and taste, conveying a sense of personal refinement. Architects like Robert Adam, in his design of private residences, skillfully incorporated classical elements into domestic settings, blending the grandeur of classical architecture with the functional needs of a home. Homes such as Kenwood House in London or Monticello in Virginia exemplify how neoclassical architecture in private buildings was employed to create spaces that were both intellectually stimulating and visually pleasing, reflecting the status and cultural aspirations of the owners. Though the use of neoclassical style differed between public and private buildings, the overarching theme remained consistent. Both sought to communicate values of reason, order, and harmony. Whether in monumental public structures or elegant private homes, neoclassical architecture expressed a vision of society rooted in the ideals of classical antiquity, shaping the built environment of the 18th and early 19th centuries. Chapter 5: Neoclassical Sculpture and Painting. Neoclassical sculpture and painting were instrumental in expressing the ideals of the Enlightenment and the revival of classical antiquity. Both art forms sought to capture the virtues of simplicity, harmony, and idealized beauty, drawing inspiration from ancient Greek and Roman art. They stood in stark contrast to the preceding Baroque and Rococo styles, which were characterized by ornate detail and exuberance. Instead, neoclassical artists aimed to evoke rationality, moral virtue, and heroism, responding to the intellectual currents of their time. In sculpture, the neoclassical period marked a return to the clean, restrained forms seen in ancient works. Sculptors like Antonio Canova and Johann Gottfried Schadow were celebrated for their refined techniques and emphasis on the human form. Canova, perhaps the most renowned neoclassical sculptor, created works that embodied the grace and idealized beauty of classical antiquity. His sculptures, such as Psyche Revived by Cupid's Kiss and the Three Graces, are characterized by smooth marble surfaces and delicate poses, reflecting both the elegance of Greek sculpture and the moral messages associated with classical themes. Canova's works were not merely representations of the human body, but idealized portrayals of human virtue, often inspired by classical mythology or history. His ability to capture both beauty and emotion made him a central figure in the neoclassical movement. While Canova's sculptures emphasized beauty, other artists like Antonio Corradini and Jean-Baptiste Carpeaux approached the medium with a focus on moral or historical themes. They used the human form to tell stories of sacrifice, heroism, and virtue, highlighting moral lessons rooted in classical philosophy. This focus on storytelling, combined with the emphasis on idealized physical forms, aligned with the neoclassical belief in the power of art to educate and inspire. In painting, neoclassical artists followed similar principles, favoring historical, mythological, and allegorical subjects. Jacques-Louis David, one of the foremost painters of the period, became famous for his dramatic depictions of historical events and heroic subjects, such as the death of Socrates and Napoleon crossing the Alps. David's works embodied the neoclassical ideals of heroism and sacrifice, often using sharp lines, bold contrasts, and dramatic compositions to heighten the emotional impact of his subjects. His focus on clarity, order, and moral themes was in direct opposition to the emotional and ornate Baroque style that preceded it. Other notable neoclassical painters, such as Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, also embraced the classical tradition. Ingres' works, such as Le Grand Odalisque, incorporated classical influence in the form of idealized figures and serene compositions. However, he introduced a degree of sensuality into his works, which set him apart from other neoclassical artists. Ingres' precise draftsmanship and meticulous attention to the human form further reflected the movement's commitment to technical skill and the portrayal of beauty through classical ideals. Both neoclassical sculpture and painting reflected the Enlightenment's focus on reason, order, and virtue. Artists sought to depict figures and scenes that embodied the noble and rational aspects of humanity, whether through the idealized human form in sculpture or the depiction of heroic deeds and moral lessons in painting. Through these art forms, neoclassical artists aimed to revive the classical traditions while also contributing to the cultural and intellectual climate of their time, leaving a lasting legacy in the world of art. Return to classical themes, mythology, history, and allegory. In both neoclassical sculpture and painting, a significant return to classical themes marked a clear departure from the ornamental and emotionally charged Baroque and Rococo styles that preceded it. Neoclassical artists deliberately turned to the classical traditions of ancient Greece and Rome, using mythological, historical, and allegorical subjects as central themes in their works. This return to classical themes was not just a stylistic choice, but also a reflection of the intellectual currents of the Enlightenment, where reason, morality, and civic virtue were prioritized. Mythology was a dominant theme in neoclassical art, as artists sought to reimagine ancient Greek and Roman myths in a manner that emphasized the virtues and moral lessons embedded within them. Mythological figures, such as Hercules, Venus, and Apollo, were reinterpreted in works that focused on ideals of heroism, sacrifice, love, and beauty. Sculptors like Antonio Canova and painters like Jacques-Louis David often used these mythological subjects to express moral values. For example, Canova's Psyche Revived by Cupid's Kiss portrays the myth of Cupid and Psyche, emphasizing the themes of love, redemption, and the triumph of virtue. The treatment of mythological subjects was often idealized, with figures portrayed as embodying perfect beauty and moral strength, thus reinforcing the neoclassical belief in the power of art to instruct and elevate the viewer. History was another key theme that neoclassical artists explored, often through the depiction of significant moments from antiquity or contemporary events that reflected the era's ideals of republicanism and virtue. The focus on historical subjects allowed artists to engage with themes of sacrifice, moral duty, and political values. Jacques-Louis David's The Death of Socrates and The Oath of the Horatii are prime examples of this, as they draw on historical events to explore themes of heroism, honor, and civic duty. These works were not merely historical recounts, but moral lessons that sought to inspire viewers to reflect on the importance of virtue and rationality in both personal and public life. Through such historical depictions, neoclassical artists sought to align contemporary political movements, such as the French Revolution, with the values of classical antiquity. Allegory, the representation of abstract concepts through personified figures, was another key theme in neoclassical art. Allegorical figures were often used to embody concepts such as justice, liberty, reason, and virtue. These figures, derived from classical tradition, were depicted with idealized features and were often shown in powerful poses, symbolizing the strength and importance of the abstract qualities they represented. In works such as David's The Death of Marat, allegorical elements were combined with historical narrative to convey complex ideas about the political climate of the time. Ultimately, the return to classical themes in neoclassical art reflected a desire to return to the perceived purity, rationality, and moral clarity of ancient Greece and Rome. Through mythology, history, and allegory, neoclassical artists sought to convey lessons that were both visually stunning and intellectually stimulating, reaffirming the Enlightenment ideals of reason, virtue, and civic responsibility. These themes continue to be among the most enduring and influential in Western art history. The depiction of heroism and civic virtue in art. One of the defining characteristics of neoclassical art is its emphasis on heroism and civic virtue, ideals that were drawn from the philosophical and political currents of the Enlightenment. Artists of this period used historical and mythological subjects to celebrate figures who exemplified these virtues, portraying them as paragons of moral strength, bravery, and selflessness. The depiction of heroism and civic virtue was not only a stylistic choice, but also an attempt to inspire the public to embody these values in their own lives, reflecting the societal aspirations of the time. Heroism in neoclassical art was often depicted through scenes of individuals who made great personal sacrifices for the greater good. This idealized portrayal of heroism was rooted in the values of ancient Greece and Rome, where heroes were celebrated for their courage, integrity, and dedication to their communities. Paintings like Jacques-Louis David's The Oath of the Haudry exemplify this ideal, with the three Roman brothers swearing an oath to defend their country at the expense of their personal lives. The figures are depicted with strong, determined expressions, embodying the neoclassical belief in the importance of duty and self-sacrifice for the greater good. The composition itself, with its strong linearity and bold symmetry, further emphasizes the moral clarity and order associated with heroism. The concept of civic virtue, closely tied to heroism, was also central to neoclassical art. This idea held that individuals, particularly those in positions of power, should act in the service of the public good, putting aside personal ambition and selfish desires in favor of the well-being of the community. Neoclassical artists, such as David, sought to portray figures who embodied these qualities, often using historical or allegorical subjects to underscore the importance of virtue in both personal and public life. In works like The Death of Socrates, David captures the philosopher's unwavering commitment to his principles, even in the face of death. Socrates' calm demeanor as he prepares to drink the hemlock symbolizes the triumph of reason and virtue over fear and personal interest, reinforcing the Enlightenment ideals of rational thought and moral integrity. Civic virtue was also reflected in the way that neoclassical artists depicted public figures and historical events, such as those from the French Revolution. Artists sought to immortalize the actions of revolutionary leaders, portraying them as martyrs for the cause of liberty, equality, and fraternity. The idealization of figures like Jean-Paul Marat in David's The Death of Marat imbued their sacrifice with a sense of moral righteousness, elevating their actions to the level of heroic deeds. Ultimately, the depiction of heroism and civic virtue in neoclassical art was a reflection of the period's philosophical and political ideals. By portraying figures who exemplified these virtues, artists sought to inspire viewers to aspire to the same moral heights, reinforcing the notion that personal sacrifice for the collective good was the highest form of nobility. In this way, neoclassical art served not just as a visual aesthetic, but as a moral and civic guide for society. Evolution of style, from idealized forms to realism. The evolution of style in neoclassical art marked a shift from the idealized, harmonious forms of the earlier period to a more grounded and realistic representation of the human figure in everyday life. While neoclassical artists initially drew heavily from the classical ideals of ancient Greece and Rome, with their focus on beauty, proportion, and moral virtue, the later stages of the movement began to embrace a greater emphasis on naturalism and the depiction of the human experience in a more truthful, less stylized manner. This transition paved the way for the emergence of realism in the 19th century, a style that would further distance itself from idealization and focus on depicting life as it was. At the height of the neoclassical period, artists like Jacques-Louis David and Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres adhered closely to the principles of classical art. Figures were often idealized, depicted in highly stylized poses that emphasize grace, symmetry, and proportion. David's works, such as The Death of Socrates and The Oath of the Hohelai, are prime examples of this idealized approach. These paintings were not meant to be literal representations of historical events, but rather symbolic depictions of heroism and virtue. The figures in these works are depicted with perfect anatomical precision and idealized beauty, in keeping with the classical tradition of representing the human body in its most perfect form. The emphasis was on elevating the subject to the level of moral and intellectual ideals, rather than focusing on the reality of individual human experience. However, as the neoclassical period progressed, a growing sense of realism began to take root. Artists began to move away from the strict adherence to classical proportions and idealized beauty, opting instead to depict their subjects in a more naturalistic manner. This shift was influenced in part by the social and political changes of the time, as well as by the scientific advancements in anatomy and the study of human form. Artists such as Ingres, while still influenced by the classical tradition, began to incorporate more individualized and less stylized depictions of the human figure. Ingres' La Grande Odalisque, for example, retains the smooth, polished surfaces of classical art, but also introduces a greater sense of sensuality and realism in the portrayal of the female form. The transition toward realism was also influenced by the rise of Romanticism, which focused on emotion, individuality, and the sublime. Romantic artists rejected the controlled, idealized world of Neoclassicism in favor of more expressive and spontaneous depictions of human experience. The shift from the idealized forms of Neoclassicism to the realism of the 19th century reflected a broader cultural movement that sought to connect art with the realities of everyday life, rather than lofty ideals. This evolution in style, from the idealized forms of neoclassical art to the realism of later movements, reflects a deepening of the artist's engagement with the world around them. While neoclassicism initially sought to elevate the human form to its most perfect state, later developments moved toward a more honest and raw depiction of humanity, laying the foundation for the modern artistic movements that followed. Neoclassical portraiture. Neoclassical portraiture emerged as a significant artistic genre during the late 18th and early 19th centuries, reflecting the intellectual and cultural values of the Enlightenment and the neoclassical revival. This style of portraiture was characterized by a focus on idealized representation, simplicity, and a sense of dignity, drawing on the classical traditions of ancient Greece and Rome. Artists sought to capture not only the physical likeness of their subjects, but also their moral character and social standing, often elevating their status through the use of classical elements and compositional techniques. Unlike the ornate and often theatrical portraiture of the preceding Rococo period, neoclassical portraiture embraced a more restrained and formal approach. The subjects were depicted with calm expressions, often with an air of solemnity and introspection. Clothing was typically simple and elegant, reflecting the ideals of simplicity and virtue that were central to the neoclassical movement. The use of draped fabrics and classical poses, often inspired by Roman busts and statues, further enhanced the timeless and noble character of the portraits. These works sought to convey a sense of moral strength, intellect, and virtue, rather than focusing on lavish details or emotional expression. Prominent artists like Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres and Thomas Gainsborough were key figures in the development of neoclassical portraiture. Ingres, for example, brought a highly polished technique to his portraits, combining idealized forms with a careful study of human anatomy. His famous portrait of Madame Moitessier exemplifies the neoclassical approach, with the subject depicted in an elegant pose, her attire modest yet refined, and her facial expression calm and composed. The portrait exudes a sense of dignity and grace, qualities that were central to the neoclassical aesthetic. In England, Thomas Gainsborough also embraced a more restrained and naturalistic approach to portraiture. While his style retained elements of Rococo, his later works, such as The Blue Boy, demonstrated a neoclassical sensibility, with the subject portrayed in an idealized but realistic manner. Gainsborough's portraits often emphasized the individual's character and moral standing, presenting subjects in a way that highlighted their elegance and refinement, rather than their wealth or social status. Neoclassical portraiture also played an important role in the representation of political figures, especially during periods of revolution and social change. Portraits of leaders like George Washington or Napoleon Bonaparte were designed to convey their authority, virtue, and commitment to the ideals of the state. Artists used classical symbols and poses to elevate these figures, portraying them not just as political leaders, but as embodiments of civic virtue and national identity. Overall, neoclassical portraiture represented a departure from the more ornamental and frivolous portrayals of the previous century, instead focusing on the timeless qualities of simplicity, virtue, and moral integrity. Through the lens of neoclassicism, portraiture became a tool for conveying not only the outward appearance of individuals, but also their moral character, ideals, and social importance. The impact of neoclassical art on later movements. Neoclassical art, with its emphasis on reason, simplicity, and the revival of classical ideals, had a profound influence on later art movements, leaving a lasting legacy that shaped the course of Western art history. While neoclassical artists were deeply inspired by the art of ancient Greece and Rome, they also played a pivotal role in shaping the artistic, cultural, and intellectual currents that would define the 19th century. The movement's focus on heroism, moral virtue, and intellectual clarity set the stage for the Romantic, Realist, and even early Modernist movements, each of which responded to neoclassicism in unique ways. The Romantic movement, which emerged in the late 18th century, was in many ways a direct reaction to the ideals of neoclassicism. While neoclassical artists valued order, reason, and idealized beauty, Romanticism emphasized emotion, individualism, and the sublime. Romantic artists such as Eugène Delacroix and Francisco Goya rebelled against the restrained, controlled forms of neoclassical art, embracing dramatic, emotional subject matter and exploring themes of passion, nature, and the irrational. Although Romantic artists rejected the rigidity of neoclassicism, they nevertheless inherited its focus on grand historical narratives and moral themes, using those same elements to express more personal and emotive experiences. Realism, which followed Romanticism in the mid-19th century, also had its roots in the classical tradition. Realist artists like Gustave Courbet sought to represent the world as it truly was, often focusing on the everyday lives of ordinary people. This marked a departure from the idealized forms of neoclassical art, yet the movement still borrowed from neoclassical techniques, such as the careful attention to the human form and the desire for clarity and precision. In fact, many realist artists look to the anatomy and proportions emphasized by neoclassical artists as a foundation for their depictions of real life. Realism was influenced by neoclassical ideas about technique and composition, but it rejected the idealization of figures, instead choosing to portray human beings in a more grounded and truthful manner. The development of modernism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was another critical stage in the evolution of art. While modernist artists moved away from classical traditions altogether, they were deeply influenced by the intellectual climate that neoclassicism helped shape. Neoclassical art's pursuit of clarity, simplicity, and rational order laid the groundwork for the artistic and philosophical inquiries that defined modernism, especially in its quest to break away from tradition and explore new forms of expression. The geometric abstraction and experimentation of artists like Pablo Picasso and Wassily Kandinsky can trace some of their intellectual and technical roots back to the structured, precise approach of neoclassical art. In addition to influencing stylistic developments, neoclassical art also shaped the intellectual and cultural foundations for later movements. Its focus on the importance of classical antiquity, historical narratives, and civic virtue resonated with the social and political changes of the time, inspiring artists to think about the role of art in shaping society. The neoclassical ideal of art as a means to elevate public morals and reflect societal ideals would continue to inform debates about art's role in the modern world, even as future movements embraced more diverse and experimental approaches. Ultimately, neoclassical art's impact on later movements was both direct and indirect. It set the stage for the intellectual, technical, and thematic concerns that would define Romanticism, Realism, and Modernism, and its legacy can still be seen in the ways contemporary artists engage with tradition and innovation. Chapter 6: Neoclassicism and the French Revolution. The relationship between Neoclassicism and the French Revolution is a compelling intersection of art, politics, and social change. Neoclassical art, with its focus on ideals such as virtue, heroism, and republicanism, found a natural alignment with the revolutionary ideals that emerged during the late 18th century in France. The period of the French Revolution was one of dramatic transformation, not only politically, but also in terms of cultural and artistic expression. Neoclassical art became a powerful tool for communicating the values of the revolution and for legitimizing the new republican order that sought to dismantle the old aristocratic regimes. As the revolution unfolded, the emphasis on rationality, civic virtue, and the rejection of monarchy aligned with the neoclassical ideals of ancient Rome and Greece, where republican values were championed. Revolutionary leaders and intellectuals saw in classical antiquity an example of the values they wished to establish in France: democracy, liberty, equality, and the active participation of citizens in public life. Neoclassical art was thus adopted by revolutionary figures as a means of symbolizing these ideals. Artists like Jacques-Louis David, who was closely associated with the revolution, used neoclassical styles to convey the heroism of the revolutionary cause and to elevate the new political figures as embodiments of civic virtue. David's work, The Death of Marat, is one of the most iconic examples of neoclassical art during the French Revolution. The painting depicts the revolutionary martyr Jean-Paul Marat in a calm, almost saintly manner, which serves to elevate him to the status of a hero and martyr of the revolutionary cause. Through the composition and the use of classical techniques, David conveys Marat's sacrifice for the revolutionary ideals of liberty and equality, aligning his image with the Stoic figures of classical antiquity. This approach was typical of how neoclassical artists depicted revolutionary heroes, placing them in noble, heroic contexts that suggested a direct link between the revolution and the great republics of the past. Furthermore, neoclassical art's portrayal of history and allegory made it a powerful tool for articulating the moral messages of the revolution. Many works from this period used classical themes and figures to express revolutionary principles, transforming mythological or historical subjects into symbols of political and social change. For example, in works like The Oath of the Horatii, David depicted scenes of sacrifice and loyalty to the state, which mirrored the revolutionary call for selflessness and commitment to the new republic. In addition to celebrating the revolution's heroes, neoclassical art also played a role in the rejection of the monarchy and the aristocracy. The lavish, ornamental style of Rococo art, which had flourished under the ancient regime, was increasingly seen as a symbol of decadence and excess, in stark contrast to the revolutionary ideals of simplicity and virtue. Neoclassical artists deliberately distanced themselves from Rococo's indulgent ornamentation, favoring a cleaner, more restrained aesthetic that reflected the perceived moral purity of the revolution. In sum, neoclassical art during the French Revolution served not only as a means of aesthetic expression, but also as a powerful ideological tool. It helped to shape the visual language of the revolution, reinforcing the values of liberty, virtue, and civic duty, and providing a cultural foundation for the political upheaval that was transforming France. Through the adoption of classical themes and ideals, neoclassical art became a means of legitimizing the revolution and giving it a sense of historical continuity with the great Republican traditions of the past. Neoclassical art as political propaganda. Neoclassical art was not only a reflection of cultural and intellectual ideals, but also a potent tool for political propaganda, particularly during the French Revolution and the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. The clarity, order, and moral virtue that characterized neoclassical art made it an ideal medium for conveying the political messages of the time, reinforcing revolutionary ideals, and promoting the authority of political leaders. Artists, especially those aligned with the revolutionary cause, used the style to shape public perception, elevate political figures, and communicate the virtues of republicanism and the new regime. One of the most prominent examples of neoclassical art being used for political propaganda is Jacques Louis David, who played a key role in shaping the visual language of the revolution. David's works were often commissioned by revolutionary leaders and reflected their values of civic virtue, self-sacrifice, and commitment to the state. His famous painting, The Oath of the Herati, exemplifies this idea. The work depicts three Roman brothers swearing an oath to defend their country, emphasizing themes of loyalty to the state and personal sacrifice for the greater good, messages that resonated deeply with the political climate of the French Revolution. By invoking classical imagery and allegories, David elevated the revolutionary cause to a higher moral plane, drawing parallels between the virtues of ancient Rome and the ideals of the new French Republic. David's painting, The Death of Marat, serves as another example of neoclassical art used as propaganda. The image of the revolutionary martyr Jean-Paul Marat is portrayed with classical composure, elevating his death to the status of a heroic sacrifice for the revolutionary cause. The simplicity of the composition and the calmness of Marat's expression are designed to emphasize his virtue and martyrdom, making his death appear not only as a personal loss, but as a symbolic act for the nation. In this way, David's work aligned the revolution with noble, virtuous ideals, presenting it as the legitimate heir to the classical republics of antiquity. The use of neoclassical art as political propaganda was not limited to the revolutionaries. When Napoleon Bonaparte rose to power, he embraced the neoclassical style as a means of asserting his authority and aligning himself with the great rulers of the past. Napoleon was often portrayed as a heroic, larger-than-life figure, reminiscent of ancient emperors and military leaders. David's Napoleon Crossing the Alps is a prime example of this, where Napoleon is depicted as a resolute and heroic leader, confidently leading his army through the Alps, a direct visual reference to the classical military leaders of antiquity. The role of neoclassical art in political propaganda was not limited to France. Across Europe, leaders sought to use the classical language of art to convey their power and legitimacy. Neoclassical style allowed for a visual language that reinforced the ideas of public service, civic virtue, and moral clarity, which aligned with the political aspirations of the time. Through its ability to evoke classical ideals and heroism, neoclassical art was used to shape public sentiment, promote political ideologies, and legitimize revolutionary and imperial leadership. In this way, neoclassical art was not only a reflection of the cultural values of its time, but also a deliberate, strategic tool in the political landscape. Through its refined aesthetic and idealized depictions of virtue, neoclassical art helped to shape the political narrative of the era, reinforcing the legitimacy of new regimes and promoting revolutionary or imperial ideals. David's role in revolutionary France. Jacques Louis David, one of the most influential artists of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, played a crucial role in shaping the visual and ideological landscape of revolutionary France. As the leading figure of the neoclassical movement, David's work was deeply intertwined with the political and social upheavals of the French Revolution, and his art became a powerful tool for communicating revolutionary ideals. David not only captured key moments of the revolution, but also actively used his art to influence public opinion, promote Republican virtues, and support the revolutionary leaders. David's commitment to the principles of the French Revolution was reflected in both his subject matter and his style. His paintings were imbued with the ideals of liberty, sacrifice, and civic virtue that were central to the revolutionary cause. One of his most famous works, The Oath of the Horatii, 1784, though painted just before the Revolution, became emblematic of the revolutionary spirit. The painting, which depicts the Roman brothers swearing an oath to defend their country, was a powerful visual metaphor for the Revolution's call to sacrifice personal interests for the greater good of the nation. The painting's focus on stoic heroism and selflessness resonated deeply with the revolutionaries' ideals of civic duty, patriotism, and commitment to the Republic. When the revolution broke out, David's role as an artist aligned him closely with the radical faction of the movement. He became an active supporter of the Jacobins and their leader, Maximilien Robespierre, and his art became a tool of propaganda for the new Republican government. David's political involvement extended beyond his work as an artist. He was appointed as a deputy to the National Convention and was deeply involved in the political discussions and decisions of the time. His commitment to the revolutionary cause led him to depict revolutionary martyrs, such as The Death of Marat, 1793, which commemorated the assassination of Jean-Paul Marat. In this iconic painting, David presents Marat as a martyr for the cause of the revolution, elevating his death to a heroic sacrifice. The composition, with its classical simplicity and emotional restraint, frames Marat's death as a noble act of devotion to the Republic. David's art also served to glorify the revolution's leaders. During the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, David shifted his focus to portraying Napoleon as a heroic, almost divine figure. His iconic work, Napoleon Crossing the Alps, 1801, presents the emperor as a conquering hero, drawing visual parallels between Napoleon and classical military leaders such as Julius Caesar. This work was not just a portrait of Napoleon, but a statement of his authority and his connection to the great rulers of history. David's ability to frame Napoleon's rule in terms of classical grandeur helped solidify the emperor's position as a leader with a legitimate claim to power, rooted in the ideals of the Roman Empire. David's art was a crucial part of the propaganda machinery that helped to legitimize and strengthen the revolutionary and imperial governments of France. Through his meticulous use of neoclassical style, David connected the French Revolution and Napoleon's regime to the esteemed traditions of ancient Rome, emphasizing virtue, sacrifice, and heroic leadership. His work not only captured pivotal moments in French history, but also shaped the way the public viewed those moments, solidifying his legacy as a central figure in the visual history of revolutionary France. The depiction of revolutionary heroes and martyrs. During the French Revolution, art became an essential vehicle for communicating the ideals of the revolution and elevating its key figures to the status of heroes and martyrs. Artists, most notably Jacques-Louis David, used neoclassical styles to depict revolutionary figures in ways that imbued them with a sense of moral grandeur and heroic sacrifice. These portrayals were not only intended to honor the individuals themselves, but also to inspire the public and reinforce the revolutionary cause, framing it as one of high moral purpose. One of the most iconic works in this genre is Jacques-Louis David's The Death of Marat, 1793, which portrays Jean-Paul Marat, a prominent revolutionary and journalist, in the moments following his assassination. Marat is depicted as a martyr, calm and serene in death, with his outstretched hand clutching a letter, symbolizing his dedication to the revolutionary cause. The image of his bloodied body contrasts with his peaceful expression, creating a powerful sense of nobility and sacrifice. Through the simplicity of the composition and the restrained use of color, David elevates Marat's death to an almost saintly level, suggesting that Marat's martyrdom is integral to the advancement of revolutionary ideals. In this portrayal, the death of Marat becomes a symbol of selfless commitment to the revolution, aligning him with the classical figures of virtue and honor. This theme of martyrdom extended beyond Marat. Revolutionary leaders and figures of the cause were often depicted in ways that emphasized their heroic actions and unwavering devotion to the Republic. David's The Oath of the Hurrah, 1784, while painted before the Revolution, came to represent the type of self-sacrifice that revolutionaries aspired to. The Horatii brothers, preparing to swear allegiance to their country before going into battle, are depicted in a manner that suggests the importance of putting the state above personal life, a sentiment that mirrored the revolutionary ethos. This type of heroic, stoic imagery became the visual language of the revolution, reinforcing the idea that personal sacrifice for the greater good was noble and necessary. In addition to martyrdom, the depiction of revolutionary heroes also became a way to validate the legitimacy of the revolution. Leaders such as Georges Danton, Maximilien Robespierre, and Napoleon Bonaparte were frequently portrayed as embodiments of virtue, courage, and strength, even when their political actions were controversial. David's The Intervention of the Sabine Women, 1799, although painted during the Revolution, is a powerful allegory of unity and reconciliation, in which the women prevent violence between Romans and Sabines, symbolizing the harmony and peace the revolutionaries hoped to achieve for France. Through such works, artists were able to reinforce the revolutionary message of unity, justice, and moral integrity. The visual representation of revolutionary heroes and martyrs served a dual purpose: to honor those who died for the cause and to inspire the public to continue fighting for the principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Through these depictions, artists contributed to the creation of a revolutionary mythology, one that connected the struggles of the present to the ideals of classical antiquity and the historical narrative of heroism and sacrifice. The legacy of these artistic portrayals helped to shape the collective memory of the French Revolution, ensuring that the revolution's heroes and martyrs would be remembered as symbols of virtue and devotion to the Republic. The symbolism of neoclassical art in revolutionary ideals. Neoclassical art, with its emphasis on order, rationality, and virtue, became a powerful tool for symbolizing the revolutionary ideals of the late 18th century. The French Revolution was not merely a political upheaval, but also a radical shift in how people understood concepts like liberty, equality, and civic responsibility. The neoclassical style, which drew on the visual language of ancient Greece and Rome, was ideally suited to convey these ideals. Artists like Jacques-Louis David, who became closely associated with the Revolution, employed classical symbolism to communicate messages of patriotism, moral duty, and sacrifice for the greater good. One of the central symbolic themes of neoclassical art during the Revolution was the idea of virtue, particularly civic virtue, which emphasized selflessness, loyalty to the state, and personal sacrifice for the collective. Ancient Rome, with its republican ideals, provided a model for the kind of virtue that revolutionaries hoped to instill in the French populace. This was reflected in many works of art that portrayed figures of sacrifice, such as The Oath of the Horatii, in which the Roman brothers swear to defend their country above all else. The stoic, unwavering commitment to the Republic in these works symbolized the kind of loyalty the revolutionaries sought to promote among the citizens of France. Another important symbol in neoclassical art was the use of heroism. Revolutionaries wanted to present themselves as heroes, defending the principles of liberty and justice against oppressive forces. Paintings, such as David's The Death of Marat, used classical techniques to portray revolutionary figures, like Marat as martyrs to the cause, elevating their deaths to acts of heroism. The solemn, dignified manner in which these figures were depicted suggested that their sacrifices were noble and in service of a higher moral order. The notion of heroism was also conveyed through allegorical depictions of the revolution as a force of righteousness, often drawing on classical themes like the triumph of justice over tyranny. In addition to heroism and virtue, freedom was another critical symbol in neoclassical art, often personified in allegorical representations of liberty. In Liberty Leading the People by Eugène Delacroix, a later example influenced by the revolutionary spirit, liberty is depicted as a strong, guiding figure leading the people to freedom, holding the flag of revolution. While Delacroix's work came after the revolution, it reflects the same symbolic use of neoclassical elements, like heroic figures and allegorical representations, to communicate the ideals of the revolution. Lastly, neoclassical art also used classical architecture and historical references to ground revolutionary ideals in a noble tradition. The revolutionaries sought to align themselves with the great republics of the past, believing their struggle was part of a broader, timeless movement for justice. Classical columns, drapery, and Stoic postures in art evoked the grandeur of ancient Rome and Greece, reinforcing the idea that the French Revolution was not just a fleeting political event, but the continuation of a noble historical narrative. Through its symbolism, neoclassical art during the French Revolution helped to elevate the revolution from a mere political struggle to a moral and historical crusade. The classical references imbued the revolution with a sense of legitimacy, connecting its ideals of liberty, virtue, and heroism to the revered traditions of ancient republics. Shifts in artistic themes during the Revolution. The French Revolution brought profound changes not only to the political and social landscape of France, but also to the themes and purposes of art. As the revolution evolved, so too did the way artists approached their subjects, reflecting the shifting ideals, emotions, and priorities of the time. The transformation of artistic themes mirrored the turbulence of the revolution, with art moving from a focus on royal patronage and religious imagery to a commitment to revolutionary ideals and civic virtues. In the early years of the revolution, much of the art was dedicated to promoting the principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Revolutionary leaders sought to present themselves as embodiments of virtue, heroism, and moral clarity, and artists responded by focusing on these figures, often portraying them in dramatic, idealized ways. One of the most significant shifts in artistic themes was the move from religious and mythological subjects to historical and political ones. The classical tradition, especially the moral and civic values of ancient Greece and Rome, became a dominant source of inspiration, with artists using these themes to reflect revolutionary ideals. The use of allegory and symbolism was common, as artists sought to communicate complex ideas through easily understood visual language. For example, images of liberty as a female figure holding a flag or sword became common, symbolizing the revolution's fight for freedom and the people's power. As the revolution progressed, the art produced became increasingly focused on portraying martyrs and heroes who had sacrificed their lives for the cause. Artists like Jacques-Louis David used the neoclassical style to create stirring depictions of revolutionary figures, presenting them as noble and virtuous martyrs. David's The Death of Marat, 1793, is one of the most iconic examples of this shift. In the painting, Marat is shown as a heroic figure, calm in death, with his martyrdom symbolizing the revolutionary sacrifice for liberty and justice. This shift emphasized a new type of heroism, one that was linked to the people's struggle against tyranny rather than traditional monarchic power or religious virtue. During the Reign of Terror, when the revolution took a darker turn, the themes of sacrifice and heroism became intertwined with the idea of political loyalty and the defense of the revolution. Art from this period often celebrated the revolutionary leaders who stood firm against internal and external enemies, including figures like Maximilien Robespierre and Georges Danton. The depiction of violence and death became more prominent, with martyrs being portrayed not only as victims, but as symbols of the revolution's righteousness and necessity. With the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, artistic themes once again shifted, this time to glorify the emperor and his regime. Neoclassical art was used to present Napoleon as a heroic leader in the mold of ancient Roman emperors. The focus shifted to imperial grandeur and military triumphs, as works like Napoleon Crossing the Alps, 1801, depicted the leader as an almost mythic figure, extending the revolutionary ideals of liberty and justice to the European continent under Napoleon's rule. In sum, the French Revolution was marked by a dramatic shift in artistic themes, from religious and royal imagery to the celebration of revolutionary ideals and heroes. Art became an essential tool for political propaganda, shaping public perception and solidifying the moral and heroic narrative of the revolution. The transformation in the themes of art reflected the changing priorities of the revolution itself, from calls for liberty to the glorification of revolutionary martyrs and later imperial grandeur. Chapter 7: Neoclassicism in England and the United States. While neoclassical art and architecture flourished in France, its influence also extended to other parts of the world, notably England and the United States, where it was embraced as a way to express both political and cultural ideals. In both countries, neoclassical style was used to symbolize a break from the past, an embrace of Enlightenment principles, and the creation of new national identities. In England, Neoclassicism had a significant impact on both art and architecture during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. As the country moved through political changes, particularly the American Revolution and the subsequent rise of industrialism, there was a growing desire to reject the ornate excesses of the Baroque and Rococo styles. English artists and architects sought to revive the simplicity and moral clarity associated with classical antiquity. In architecture, figures like Robert Adam were instrumental in popularizing the neoclassical style. Adam's designs blended classical elements with new innovations, creating elegant, harmonious spaces that emphasized balance and proportion. His work on the interior of the Adelphi Building in London is a prime example, showcasing the clean lines and symmetrical designs that became a hallmark of neoclassical architecture. Similarly, English painters like Sir Joshua Reynolds and Thomas Gainsborough were influenced by neoclassical ideals, although they were more known for their portraiture. Reynolds, in particular, used the classical past as a reference for the idealized, heroic portrayal of his subjects. His works reflected a growing interest in depicting people not just as they were, but as they could be seen through the lens of classical virtue and dignity. Portraits like Lady Sarah Bunbury, Sacrificing to the Graces, 1765, reflect the neoclassical interest in elevating the status of individuals by associating them with classical notions of nobility and grace. In the United States, the adoption of neoclassical style was closely linked to the country's formation and the ideals of the American Revolution. The Founding Fathers, many of whom were influenced by Enlightenment thought, saw ancient Greece and Rome as models for the new republic. Neoclassical architecture became a way to symbolize the democratic and republican principles on which the United States was founded. The most famous example of this is the design of the White House, created by James Hoban, and the United States Capitol, which was influenced by classical Roman temples. These buildings were intended to evoke the ideals of the Roman Republic, drawing parallels between the ancient republic and the new democratic government of the United States. American painters also adopted neoclassical themes, using the style to reflect the emerging national identity. Artists like Gilbert Stuart and John Trumbull painted portraits of the nation's leaders and pivotal moments in American history. Trumbull's work, The Declaration of Independence, 1819, exemplifies the neoclassical influence by presenting a monumental historical scene that conveys the gravity and righteousness of the nation's founding. In both England and the United States, neoclassical art and architecture served as powerful tools for expressing political aspirations and national identity. By connecting contemporary ideals with the revered classical past, neoclassicism in these countries helped to shape the visual representation of the modern state, promoting values of democracy, virtue, and civic responsibility. The influence of neoclassical architecture in Britain. Neoclassical architecture in Britain emerged as a significant movement during the late 18th and early 19th centuries, coinciding with a period of political, social, and economic change. The rise of the Enlightenment and the increasing interest in classical antiquity provided a fertile ground for the development of a style that emphasized symmetry, proportion, and the ideals of civic virtue. In Britain, neoclassical architecture was not just an aesthetic choice, but a statement about the nation's cultural and political aspirations. One of the most influential figures in British neoclassical architecture was Robert Adam, whose designs transformed the architectural landscape of the time. Adam, who was deeply inspired by classical Roman and Greek architecture, sought to create spaces that were harmonious, elegant, and refined. His work, particularly in domestic interiors and public buildings, blended classical elements with new ideas, incorporating lighter, more decorative details compared to the heavier, more formal classical styles of his predecessors. One of Adam's most famous projects was the design of the Adelphi Building in London, a prime example of neoclassical elegance. His innovative use of symmetry, clean lines, and classical motifs set the standard for British neoclassical design. Neoclassical architecture in Britain was also deeply intertwined with the ideals of the Age of Enlightenment. The revival of classical forms was seen as a way to align Britain with the intellectual and philosophical traditions of ancient Greece and Rome, emphasizing reason, democracy, and civic duty. The British elite, many of whom had traveled to Italy on the Grand Tour, were eager to incorporate the timeless beauty and ideals of classical architecture into their own country. As a result, many public buildings, such as museums, libraries, and government institutions, were constructed in the neoclassical style to symbolize rationality, order, and the growing importance of the state. In addition to Robert Adam, other prominent architects like James Stewart and John Soane contributed to the development of neoclassical architecture in Britain. Stewart, known for his work on the Bank of England and the British Museum, was instrumental in integrating classical design into Britain's public architecture. Meanwhile, John Soane, with his imaginative use of light and space, took the neoclassical style in new directions, exemplified by his design for the Bank of England and his own home, Sir John Soane's Museum, which is a treasure trove of classical-inspired design. The influence of neoclassical architecture in Britain extended beyond just the design of public and private buildings. The style played a role in shaping the national identity, symbolizing the virtues of order, rationality, and democratic ideals. Neoclassical buildings became representations of British pride and intellectual sophistication, standing as physical embodiments of the cultural and philosophical values that defined the Enlightenment era. Through its careful balance of classical forms and modern needs, neoclassical architecture in Britain helped to define an era and influence the architectural development of the Western world for generations. The neoclassical movement in American art and architecture. The neoclassical movement in American art and architecture emerged in the late 18th and early 19th centuries as the United States sought to define its identity and express its democratic ideals. Influenced by the Enlightenment and the ideals of the French and American revolutions, neoclassical style provided a visual language that emphasized reason, virtue, and civic responsibility. The movement played a crucial role in shaping the nation's public image, influencing both the design of government buildings and the portrayal of national figures in art. In architecture, Neoclassicism became the dominant style for many important government structures, symbolizing the new republic's commitment to the ideals of democracy, civic virtue, and rational governance. The United States Capitol, designed by William Thornton and later modified by Thomas Jefferson and others, is one of the most iconic examples of neoclassical architecture in America. Its design, inspired by the ancient Roman pantheon and other classical structures, was intended to convey the strength and stability of the young nation. Similarly, the White House, designed by James Hoban, also embraced neoclassical elements, with its clean lines, symmetrical proportions, and use of columns, reflecting the influence of Roman public buildings. These structures, along with others like the Virginia State Capitol, constructed by Thomas Jefferson, became powerful symbols of the American government's commitment to Republican ideals. In addition to government buildings, neoclassical style also influenced the design of private homes, especially in the more affluent classes. Architects like Charles Bulfinch and William Thornton adopted classical elements in residential designs, creating elegant, symmetrical homes that reflected the status and cultural aspirations of their owners. The use of columns, porticos, and classical motifs became increasingly popular in private estates and urban homes, particularly in the burgeoning cities of the United States. In the visual arts, neoclassical ideals were embodied in portraiture, historical painting, and sculptures. American painters such as Gilbert Stuart, John Trumbull, and Charles Willson Peale embraced the neoclassical style to portray important figures from the American Revolution and to commemorate key moments in the nation's history. Trumbull's The Declaration of Independence, 1819, for example, reflects the neoclassical interest in heroic historical narrative, presenting the Founding Fathers as dignified, virtuous figures. The emphasis on classical ideals in art was meant to elevate the status of the nation's leaders and reinforce the idea that America was the modern-day heir to the democratic traditions of ancient Greece and Rome. In sculpture, artists like Horatio Greenough and Jean-Antoine Houdon embraced neoclassical techniques to create busts and statues of prominent Americans, including George Washington. The most famous of these is Houdon's statue of Washington, which portrays the first president in the dignified, heroic style of ancient Roman leaders. This classical portrayal was not only a tribute to Washington's leadership, but also a representation of the American Republic's ideals. Overall, the neoclassical movement in America was a crucial part of the nation's cultural and political development. By adopting classical forms and themes, American artists and architects sought to create a visual identity that reflected the nation's values of democracy, liberty, and civic virtue. This movement helped shape the nation's visual language and continues to influence American art and architecture today. The role of neoclassical ideals in American identity. The neoclassical movement played a crucial role in shaping the emerging identity of the United States, reflecting the nation's ideals of democracy, virtue, and civic responsibility. As America sought to establish itself as a new republic after gaining independence from Britain, neoclassical style provided a visual language that emphasized the democratic values drawn from ancient Greece and Rome. These classical ideals were seen as the foundation for the nation's political system, and the adoption of neoclassical art and architecture became a way to reinforce and symbolize the new national identity. In the early years of the American Republic, neoclassical architecture was embraced for its association with the classical world, especially the Roman Republic, which was viewed as a model for the democratic government the United States hoped to establish. The use of columns, symmetry, and open spaces in public buildings like the White House and the United States Capitol signified the values of order, equality, and transparency. These government structures were designed not just for functionality, but to embody the very principles upon which the country was founded. The architecture of Washington, D.C., with its grandiose, classical-inspired buildings, served as a reminder of America's commitment to democratic ideals and its aspirations to be a beacon of liberty. Similarly, neoclassical ideals found expression in American art, where artists like Gilbert Stuart, John Trumbull and Charles Wilson Peale used the classical style to depict portraits of the nation's leaders and commemorate key historical events. Through portraiture, these artists sought to elevate the status of American figures, presenting them as noble, virtuous, and worthy of admiration, qualities that were central to the classical tradition. Trumbull's The Declaration of Independence, 1819, is an example of how historical painting, infused with neoclassical elements, was used to symbolize the revolutionary spirit and the heroic nature of America's founding fathers. The ideals of neoclassicism also extended to American sculpture, where works like Jean-Antoine Houdon's statue of George Washington sought to portray the nation's first president in the dignified manner of ancient Roman statesmen. These sculptures were more than just representations of individuals. They were meant to embody the virtues and ideals that the nation held dear. By adopting and adapting neoclassical themes, Americans sought to connect their new nation with the revered cultural heritage of antiquity, emphasizing the continuity of democratic ideals from the classical world to the modern era. The classical influence, seen in both architecture and art, became a symbol of American identity, reinforcing the nation's aspirations to create a just, democratic society grounded in reason and virtue. Neoclassical ideals, with their focus on civic duty, public service, and moral clarity, became deeply ingrained in the national consciousness, helping to define America's cultural identity during its formative years. Thomas Jefferson and the design of Monticello. Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States and one of the key figures in the founding of the nation, was deeply influenced by the neoclassical movement, which played a significant role in shaping both his political philosophy and personal aesthetic. Jefferson's home, Monticello, located in Virginia, is perhaps the most enduring symbol of his admiration for classical ideals. The design of Monticello reflects his belief in the principles of reason, democracy, and the values of the ancient Greeks and Romans, making it a personal manifestation of the neoclassical style and Jefferson's vision for the new American Republic. Jefferson's architectural education and taste were shaped by his extensive studies in classical literature and the visual arts, which he encountered during his travels in Europe. While serving as the U.S. ambassador to France, Jefferson became well acquainted with the classical architecture of ancient Rome and the Renaissance. He absorbed the principles of symmetry, proportion, and harmony that defined neoclassical architecture and sought to apply them in his own designs. Monticello, which he began designing in the mid-18th century and continued to refine throughout his life, combines classical elements with Jefferson's personal vision of a self-sufficient, rational, and enlightened society. The design of Monticello features a domed rotunda inspired by the Pantheon in Rome, as well as a symmetrical layout and the use of columns, which are hallmarks of neoclassical style. The central pavilion, with its iconic dome, was designed to serve as both a residence and a representation of Jefferson's ideals about government and society. Jefferson saw Monticello not only as his personal home, but as a model for the kind of rational, agrarian society he envisioned for the United States. The use of classical elements in the house was meant to convey a sense of order and intellectual sophistication, reflecting Jefferson's belief in the importance of knowledge, reason, and civic virtue. Beyond the exterior, Jefferson's attention to detail in the interior of Monticello further demonstrated his commitment to classical ideals. He designed the layout of rooms with careful consideration of symmetry and proportion, incorporating architectural features such as Palladian windows and classical columns to enhance the aesthetic appeal and functionality of the space. The furnishings and decorations, many of which were sourced from Europe, also reflected a classical style, reinforcing Jefferson's desire to create an environment that promoted learning, reflection, and intellectual exchange. Monticello was not only a personal residence for Jefferson, but also a physical representation of his commitment to the ideals of the Enlightenment and the classical world. By incorporating neoclassical design elements into his home, Jefferson sought to align his personal life with the values he espoused as a statesman, creating a lasting legacy that reflected his belief in reason, education, and democratic governance. Monticello remains a testament to the enduring influence of neoclassical architecture in shaping the identity of the American Republic. English landscape painting and neoclassical influence. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, English landscape painting underwent a significant transformation, deeply influenced by the neoclassical movement. While landscape painting in England had already existed as a genre, it was during the neoclassical period that artists began to infuse their works with classical ideals, reflecting the broader cultural shift toward reason, harmony, and the appreciation of nature in a more structured, philosophical sense. The neoclassical approach to landscape painting focused on a return to the serene, ordered beauty of nature, in contrast to the more chaotic, untamed landscapes of the previous Baroque era. Artists like Richard Wilson and Thomas Gainsborough played a pivotal role in developing the English landscape tradition during this time. Wilson, often regarded as the father of English landscape painting, was heavily influenced by classical ideals and sought to bring a sense of grandeur and order to his depictions of the British countryside. His landscapes were often infused with mythological or historical references, elevating them beyond mere depictions of nature and turning them into symbolic representations of civilization's connection to the classical world. Wilson's paintings, such as the ruins of Rome, evoke a sense of timelessness, in which the natural world and classical ruins coexist harmoniously, conveying both the fleeting nature of human achievement and the permanence of nature itself. Similarly, Thomas Gainsborough, while known for his portraits, contributed significantly to landscape painting. His works, such as Mr. and Mrs. Andrews, combine portraiture with landscape and reflect a neoclassical approach to nature. Gainsborough's treatment of the countryside was idealized, with serene, sweeping vistas and a focus on the relationship between humanity and nature, in line with the period's classical sensibilities. While his landscapes were more romanticized than those of Wilson, they still carried the neoclassical emphasis on balance, harmony, and idealization. The neoclassical influence on English landscape painting also extended to the use of perspective and composition. Landscapes were carefully structured with an emphasis on symmetry and proportion, often drawing inspiration from classical notions of beauty. This was evident in the use of formal gardens, classical ruins, and mythological references, creating a connection between the natural world and classical ideals. These elements help to elevate landscape painting as a serious art form, capable of expressing not only the beauty of nature, but also deeper philosophical and cultural themes. In conclusion, neoclassical ideals profoundly impacted English landscape painting by encouraging artists to blend the natural world with classical themes of reason, harmony, and order. This period marked a shift from the romanticized, chaotic landscapes of the past to more structured, thoughtful depictions that aligned closely with the values of the Enlightenment and the neoclassical movement, ultimately shaping the future of landscape art in Britain. Chapter 8: The Decline and Legacy of Neoclassicism. The neoclassical movement, which flourished during the late 18th and early 19th centuries, gradually began to lose its dominance in the art world as new styles emerged, particularly with the onset of Romanticism. By the mid-19th century, the rigid formalism and emphasis on reason that defined neoclassicism began to feel outdated, especially in light of the sweeping political and social changes that were taking place in Europe and the Americas. The rise of emotional expression and the celebration of individual subjectivity in Romanticism, along with the increasing industrialization of society, shifted artistic focus away from the classical ideals of order and symmetry. However, The decline of Neoclassicism did not mean the end of its influence. Instead, its legacy continued to resonate in various forms in later movements. The decline of Neoclassicism can largely be attributed to the changing political landscape. The French Revolution, which had initially embraced the democratic ideals symbolized by neoclassical art and architecture, led to the rise of more emotionally charged movements that rejected the restrained, formal qualities of neoclassicism. In art, the Romantic movement championed individualism, freedom, and emotional intensity, moving away from the rationalism and order that had characterized the neoclassical style. Romantic painters such as Eugène Delacroix and J.M.W. Turner focused on dynamic, dramatic subjects, in stark contrast to the calm, idealized forms of neoclassical works. Despite its decline, the influence of neoclassicism persisted throughout the 19th and into the 20th centuries. Its emphasis on symmetry, proportion, and classical ideals found new life in the Beaux-Arts movement and was integrated into the architecture of many government buildings, museums, and universities. For example, the neoclassical designs of buildings in Washington, D.C., such as the Lincoln Memorial, continued to reflect the style's enduring legacy. The American use of neoclassical architecture as a symbol of democratic ideals, coupled with the continued use of classical themes in art, ensured that the legacy of neoclassicism remained significant in shaping national identities and visual culture. Additionally, neoclassical portraiture and sculpture continued to inspire artists into the 20th century. The focus on heroism, virtue, and idealized forms in these works remained a touchstone for future generations of artists seeking to balance realism with idealization. The grandiose, stoic portraits of leaders and public figures in the neoclassical style continued to be a model for capturing the essence of a nation's identity and ideals, particularly in times of political upheaval or national pride. In conclusion, while neoclassicism as a dominant artistic style may have waned with the rise of Romanticism, its legacy endured in art, architecture, and culture. Its emphasis on order, rationality, and moral virtue provided a foundation for later artistic movements and continued to influence the ways in which societies understood their histories, ideals, and cultural expressions. Through its adaptation and reinterpretation, Neoclassicism remained a vital force in shaping Western visual culture well into the modern era. The emergence of Romanticism and its rejection of Neoclassicism. The emergence of Romanticism in the late 18th and early 19th centuries marked a significant shift in European art and culture, directly challenging the ideals of Neoclassicism. While Neoclassicism had emphasized order, reason, and classical restraint, Romanticism sought to break free from these constraints by prioritizing emotion, individualism, and the sublime. This shift was not merely aesthetic, but reflected deeper changes in society, particularly in response to the political and social upheavals of the time, such as the French Revolution and the Industrial Revolution. One of the key reasons for Romanticism's rejection of Neoclassicism was its growing dissatisfaction with the rational and rigid principles that neoclassical art represented. The Enlightenment, which had heavily influenced Neoclassicism, emphasized reason, scientific inquiry, and the idea of universal truths. However, many artists, writers, and thinkers began to feel that these ideals ignored the complexity of human emotion and the power of individual experience. Romanticism emerged as a response to this, embracing imagination, intuition, and the irrational. Artists sought to capture the emotional depth of human experience, emphasizing themes like passion, the sublime, and the mysteries of nature. In contrast to the idealized, harmonious compositions of Neoclassicism, Romantic art often focused on dramatic, turbulent subjects, such as intense human struggle or the overwhelming power of nature. The works of Romantic painters like Eugène Delacroix and J.M.W. Turner rejected the calm, balanced forms that had characterized neoclassical art. Instead, they embraced dynamic compositions, vivid colors, and energetic brushstrokes, which conveyed emotional intensity and a sense of personal expression. Romantic artists were more interested in the subjective experience of the individual rather than in the public virtues and moral clarity that neoclassical art often depicted. Romanticism also reflected a growing sense of nationalism and a focus on the unique cultural identity of individual nations, whereas Neoclassicism had frequently idealized universal values drawn from ancient Greece and Rome. In this sense, Romanticism was a more individualized and culturally specific movement, celebrating national history, folklore, and the unique qualities of different peoples and places. This shift was not limited to visual arts. It also influenced literature, music, and philosophy. Writers such as Johann Wolfgang von Goethe and Victor Hugo explored themes of personal freedom and the emotional depths of the human soul, while composers like Ludwig van Beethoven created music that conveyed intense emotion and individuality. In conclusion, the rise of Romanticism marked a fundamental break from the ideals of Neoclassicism. By rejecting the emphasis on reason, symmetry, and classical restraint, Romanticism embraced the power of emotion, personal expression, and the sublime. This shift in artistic values had a lasting impact on the trajectory of Western art, influencing subsequent movements and shaping the cultural landscape of the 19th century. The enduring influence of neoclassical aesthetics. Despite the eventual decline of neoclassicism as a dominant artistic movement, its influence continues to be felt in various forms of art, architecture, and design. While the rise of Romanticism in the 19th century marked a shift away from neoclassical ideals, many of the core principles of neoclassicism, such as emphasis on order, proportion, and the celebration of classical ideals, remained foundational to Western art and culture. The lasting impact of neoclassical aesthetics is visible in both historical contexts and contemporary interpretations, underscoring its enduring relevance. One of the most prominent legacies of neoclassicism is its profound influence on architecture. The use of columns, symmetrical designs, and the incorporation of classical elements such as domes and pediments became staples of public architecture, especially in governmental and civic buildings. In the United States, neoclassical architecture was instrumental in shaping the identity of the fledgling republic. Buildings such as the White House and the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., are enduring symbols of the nation's values of democracy, reason, and civic virtue, ideals strongly associated with the classical world. The continued use of neoclassical elements in architecture today, particularly in government and educational institutions, reflects its deep-rooted connection to democratic ideals. In visual art, the focus on idealized human forms and the representation of virtuous, heroic figures continued to influence artists long after the neoclassical era, while later movements like Romanticism and Realism shifted the focus toward more expressive and individualistic themes. The formal techniques and compositional approaches of neoclassicism were still employed by artists well into the 19th and 20th centuries. The clarity of line, restrained color palette, and emphasis on balanced compositions can still be seen in the work of artists who sought to reconcile modern styles with classical tradition. Moreover, the enduring influence of neoclassical aesthetics extends beyond traditional visual arts and architecture to areas like literature and design. Writers and philosophers of the 18th and 19th centuries, many of whom were influenced by the rationalism of the Enlightenment and the classical past, continued to draw on neoclassical themes of reason, virtue, and moral clarity. In design, the clean lines, proportion, and restrained elegance of neoclassical style have persisted in furniture, decorative arts, and fashion, highlighting the timeless appeal of classical aesthetics. In the modern era, neoclassical ideals have been revived and reinterpreted in various ways, particularly in movements like Neoclassicism in the early 20th century and the Beaux-Arts style. These reinterpretations demonstrate the lasting appeal of classical form and structure, ensuring that neoclassical aesthetics continue to resonate within contemporary visual culture. In conclusion, while the neoclassical movement may have reached its zenith during the 18th and early 19th centuries, its aesthetic principles remain deeply embedded in art, architecture, and culture. The timeless qualities of order, harmony, and intellectual sophistication ensure that neoclassical aesthetics remain an enduring force, continually inspiring new generations of artists, architects, and thinkers. Neoclassicism's impact on modern art and architecture. Neoclassicism, which flourished in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, continues to have a profound influence on modern art and architecture. The movement's emphasis on order, symmetry, and the revival of classical ideals provided a foundation for later artistic and architectural developments, particularly in the way that both public and private spaces are designed and the ways in which art communicates cultural values. Despite the rise of movements like Romanticism and Modernism, the core principles of Neoclassicism still inform contemporary artistic practices and architectural design. In art, Neoclassicism's focus on rationalism, clarity, and idealized forms laid the groundwork for later movements such as academicism, which continued to prioritize technical precision and classical themes. While modernism ultimately shifted away from the neoclassical approach, seeking new forms of expression through abstraction and breaking traditional rules, neoclassical influence can still be seen in the importance placed on structure and composition. Modern artists, especially in the early 20th century, would often return to classical references in their work, reinterpreting ancient themes with modern techniques. The commitment to the human form, balance, and proportion found in neoclassical art provided a rich legacy for modern artists to draw upon, especially in the realm of figurative art. In architecture, neoclassicism's impact remains even more pronounced. The revival of classical architectural elements such as columns, domes, and pediments in neoclassical design was adapted and incorporated into many public buildings in the 19th and early 20th centuries. The use of classical styles in the construction of government buildings, museums, and libraries reflected a desire to associate modern institutions with the values of antiquity, values like democracy, reason, and civic virtue. In cities like Washington, D.C. and Paris, neoclassical architecture continues to define the civic landscape, with structures like the White House, the Capitol Building, and the Pantheon reflecting the lasting influence of the classical past. Moreover, neoclassical ideals were integrated into the Beaux-Arts movement, which dominated architecture in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The Beaux-Arts style adopted many neoclassical elements, such as grandeur, symmetry, and ornamentation, while also blending them with modern techniques and new materials. This fusion helped shape the development of monumental, neoclassical-inspired structures like the Grand Palais in Paris and the New York Public Library. In modern times, neoclassical ideas also influence minimalist and contemporary architecture, where balance and proportion remain central to design principles. Architects such as Robert A. M. Stern have revitalized neoclassical aesthetics in their works, incorporating classical elements into modern designs. This shows that despite the ever-evolving landscape of contemporary architecture and art, neoclassical ideas continue to provide a timeless framework for understanding beauty, order, and humanism in design. In conclusion, neoclassicism's impact on modern art and architecture is both lasting and multifaceted. Its emphasis on classical ideals, symmetry, and humanistic values continues to shape contemporary artistic practices and architectural design, ensuring that its influence endures across centuries. Neoclassical resurgence in the 20th century. While the dominance of neoclassicism waned in the face of Romanticism and Modernism, the principles of the movement saw a resurgence in the 20th century, especially in architecture and design. This revival reflected a renewed interest in classical ideals of beauty, order, and symmetry during a period marked by rapid industrialization, technological advancement, and political change. The early 20th century saw artists and architects revisiting neoclassical forms, integrating them into new creative contexts, and applying their timeless principles to the modern world. In architecture, The resurgence of neoclassical elements was particularly evident in the Beaux-Arts movement and in the construction of monumental government and civic buildings. Beaux-Arts architects, especially those trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, drew heavily from classical Greek and Roman aesthetics while embracing the modern advances of the time. This style became synonymous with grandeur, symmetry, and ornamentation, seen in iconic structures like the New York Public Library, Grand Central Terminal, and the Palais Garnier in Paris. These buildings fused neoclassical motifs, such as columns, arches, and domes, with modern construction techniques, presenting a bridge between the classical past and the rapidly changing future. The neoclassical revival was also reflected in the design of monuments and public spaces, where architects sought to convey ideals of stability, democracy, and civic virtue. In the United States, the Lincoln Memorial, designed by architect Henry Bacon in 1922, is a prime example of how neoclassical aesthetics were employed to evoke the democratic ideals of ancient Greece and Rome. The imposing Doric columns and the statue of Abraham Lincoln within serve as a tribute to the nation's values and its struggle for unity. In art, neoclassical influences continued to manifest, albeit in more subtle ways. During the early 20th century, the art world saw movements like the arts and crafts movement and the neoclassical revival within the figurative tradition. Artists such as Jacques Lipchitz and Giorgio de Chirico drew on classical forms and themes, reinterpreting them within modern frameworks. Their works reflected a balance between the representation of the human figure and a focus on classical ideals, yet were adapted to the increasingly abstract and fragmented aesthetic of the time. The impact of neoclassical principles also extended to design and fashion. The clean lines and balanced proportions associated with neoclassical aesthetics resurfaced in everything from interior design to haute couture fashion, with designers like Christian Dior incorporating classical elements into their collections. In conclusion, the neoclassical resurgence in the 20th century was marked by a re-engagement with classical aesthetics across a range of artistic and architectural practices, whether through the grandeur of Beaux-Arts architecture, the reinterpretation of classical themes in modern art, or the influence on design and fashion. Neoclassical principles remained an enduring source of inspiration, helping to shape the cultural landscape of the 20th century. Conclusion: Neoclassicism's role in shaping art history. Neoclassicism played a pivotal role in shaping the trajectory of Western art history, serving as a bridge between the classical ideals of antiquity and the dynamic shifts of modern artistic movements. Emerging in the 18th century as a reaction against the extravagance of the Baroque and Rococo styles, Neoclassicism sought to return to the simplicity, order, and rationality found in the art and architecture of ancient Greece and Rome. This revival was not just an aesthetic choice, but a reflection of the philosophical and political shifts of the time, particularly the Enlightenment and the ideals of reason, democracy, and civic virtue. Through its emphasis on idealized human forms, balanced compositions, and classical themes like mythology, history, and allegory, Neoclassicism defined the art world for much of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Iconic figures such as Jacques-Louis David, Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, and Antonio Canova embodied the movement's devotion to portraying heroism, virtue, and the human capacity for reason. Their work not only reflected the social and political climates of their time, but also set the stage for the future of art by establishing standards of technical precision and moral clarity. The movement's influence extended beyond painting and sculpture, shaping architecture, design, and even political symbolism. Neoclassical architecture, with its grand columns, domes, and symmetrical layouts, became synonymous with power and democratic ideals, particularly in the United States and revolutionary France. Buildings like the White House and the Pantheon in Paris stand as lasting symbols of the movement's ideals. Moreover, neoclassical art and architecture became a tool for political propaganda, reinforcing the values of the French Revolution and the democratic principles emerging in the New World. Despite the rise of Romanticism and other modern movements, Neoclassicism's impact persisted into the 20th century, influencing both the Beaux-Arts style and the resurgence of classical aesthetics in contemporary architecture and design. The movement's focus on balance, proportion, and rationality provided a foundation for later generations of artists and architects to build upon and reinterpret within their own contexts. In conclusion, Neoclassicism's profound role in shaping art history cannot be overstated. Its legacy, from its philosophical foundations to its lasting influence on the visual and architectural arts, has provided an enduring framework for understanding beauty, order, and intellectual engagement in art. The movement's principles continue to resonate today, affirming its place as a cornerstone in the history of Western art. Chapter 9, Conclusion. Neoclassicism, as a pivotal artistic and cultural movement, not only reshaped the landscape of 18th and 19th century art, but also laid the groundwork for numerous artistic, philosophical, and political developments that followed. From its origins in the intellectual currents of the Enlightenment to its full manifestation in the works of key artists and architects, Neoclassicism represented a return to the ideals of ancient Greece and Rome, driven by a desire for order, balance, and moral clarity in both art and society. As such, it became a reflection of the era's broader ideals of reason, democracy, and the pursuit of virtue. The movement's influence is evident across a wide range of artistic fields, including painting, sculpture, architecture, and design. Artists such as Jacques-Louis David and Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres brought classical forms and themes to life in their work, establishing a standard for future generations of artists. In architecture, Neoclassicism's revival of Greek and Roman structures, exemplified by buildings like the Pantheon in Paris and the White House in Washington, D.C., became symbols of the ideals of democracy, civic virtue, and Enlightenment rationalism. The movement not only influenced the construction of government buildings, but also deeply impacted the design of private homes, memorials, and public spaces, leaving a lasting imprint on urban landscapes. Neoclassicism's philosophical foundations, rooted in Enlightenment ideals, contributed to shaping modern Western thought. The movement's focus on reason, individualism, and the importance of historical and moral continuity resonated across different fields, from politics to education. Its impact was particularly evident during revolutionary times, as neoclassical art and architecture became tools for propaganda and identity formation, both in revolutionary France and the United States. The visual representation of revolutionary ideals through neoclassical art helped to define the political and cultural narratives of these nations, framing their quest for freedom and justice through the lens of classical antiquity. Even as movements such as Romanticism, Realism, and Modernism emerged, Neoclassicism never fully disappeared. Its principles have been revisited and revived throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, particularly in architecture, where neoclassical elements continue to influence designs that convey tradition, stability, and enduring cultural values. In conclusion, neoclassicism has proven to be an enduring and transformative force in the history of art and culture. Its impact is still felt today in the way we understand art, architecture, and the relationship between aesthetics and society. The movement's commitment to classical ideals of beauty, order, and virtue provides an enduring legacy that continues to shape contemporary culture and artistic expression.